The discovery did not announce itself as extraordinary. There was no singular moment of realization, no audible shift in tone, no immediate consensus that something unprecedented had occurred. At first, it appeared as an inconsistency, an irregularity embedded within otherwise coherent data. A deviation small enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to resist erasure. Scientists encounter such deviations constantly. Most dissolve under scrutiny. This one did not. It remained, unchanged by recalibration, unaffected by repetition, present across instruments that shared no common mode of failure. Something had been found, and no one knew how to explain it. The environment in which the discovery occurred was not exotic by reputation, yet it was extreme by function. It existed at the intersection of multiple constraints: pressure, energy limitation, isolation, and scale. Conditions where models are stretched thin and assumptions quietly fail. The system under observation had been studied for decades. Its behavior was well characterized. Its parameters were considered stable. That stability was the very reason the anomaly stood out so sharply. It did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from order. The first indication was numerical. A pattern appeared where none should exist, repeating, structured, resistant to noise reduction. When the data were segmented, the pattern persisted. When the resolution was altered, it reconfigured but did not vanish. When alternative instruments were consulted, the same structure appeared again, offset in form but identical in constraint. This ruled out artifact. This ruled out coincidence. What remained was the least comfortable possibility: observation without framework. At no point did the data suggest malfunction. There was no drift, no degradation, no threshold breach. The signal, if it could be called, that existed precisely within expected operational limits, yet behaved in ways those limits were never designed to accommodate. It did not violate physical law. It simply refused to align with existing interpretation. This distinction mattered. Violations can be challenged. Misalignments cannot. As analysis deepened, the anomaly demonstrated a peculiar property. It was internally consistent, but externally disconnected. Its internal structure followed rules, relationships that held under transformation, correlations that survived scaling, boundaries that remained intact regardless of analytical method. Yet none of these rules corresponded to known processes. It did not map onto established mechanisms. It did not resemble transitional states. It did not behave like noise or emergence. It behaved like something complete, but unclassified. Attempts to contextualize it failed quietly. When compared against known datasets, it aligned with none. When simulated under theoretical models, it either collapsed entirely or destabilized the model itself. When simplified, it lost nothing essential. When complicated, it gained nothing explanatory. This was not a case of insufficient detail. It was a case of incompatible description. The thing that had been found could be described precisely, but not meaningfully. One of the most troubling aspects was its persistence. The anomaly did not fade over time. It did not resolve into a known state. It did not transition. Repeated observation yielded the same structure, the same constraints, the same refusal to clarify. It was not evolving. It was not reacting. It simply remained. This persistence eliminated entire classes of explanation. Transient phenomena decay. Instrumental artifacts drift. Biological systems fluctuate. This did none of these. The longer the anomaly was observed, the clearer its boundaries became. It occupied a defined region of parameter space, neither expanding nor contracting. It interacted with its environment only in the most minimal sense, leaving no detectable trace beyond its own presence. It did not propagate. It did not diminish. It did not consume measurable energy in expected ways. And yet, it existed within the system, undeniably, unavoidably, and repeatedly. This placed scientists in an unfamiliar position. Normally, explanation precedes certainty. Here, Certainty preceded explanation. The anomaly was real by every operational standard. It was not hypothetical. It was not inferred. It was measured. What it was, however, remained inaccessible. The vocabulary of the field began to thin. Papers grew cautious. Language shifted toward neutrality terms like feature, structure, persistent irregularity. No one named it. Naming implies understanding. What had been found did not behave like a discovery waiting to be integrated. It behaved like a limit, a boundary condition that had always existed but had only now been encountered. It suggested that the system under observation was complete in ways previously unrecognized, that its behavior included regimes that did not lead toward explanation, only toward recognition. The most unsettling realization came slowly, and not everyone accepted it at once. The anomaly did not appear to be unfinished. It did not appear to be a precursor to something else. It did not suggest that more data would resolve it. It appeared finished. Whatever process produced it had already concluded. Whatever rules governed it were already in effect. Scientists were not witnessing emergence. They were witnessing presence. And presence without explanation is a rare condition in science. What had been found did not demand urgency. It did not threaten existing structures. It did not invalidate prior knowledge. It simply occupied a space that knowledge could not enter without breaking its own assumptions. The system remained functional. Predictions remained accurate elsewhere. Only here within this narrow, precise region understanding stopped advancing. Scientists had found something, and the more carefully they looked, the clearer it became that explanation was not delayed, it was absent. As the anomaly persisted, the nature of the problem began to shift. It was no longer a question of verification. That stage had been exhausted quickly and decisively. Independent instruments confirmed the same structure. Independent teams reproduced the same results without coordination. Environmental variables were accounted for, controlled, and eliminated one by one. The anomaly remained unchanged. This left scientists facing a rarer and more destabilizing condition, not uncertainty about whether something existed, but uncertainty about how existence itself was being expressed within the system. The anomaly displayed an unusual relationship with scale. When observed at coarse resolution, it appeared as a smooth deviation, an almost negligible distortion embedded in otherwise predictable behavior. As resolution increased, that smoothness fractured into discrete internal structures, each governed by its own constraints, yet maintaining coherence with the whole. This fractal-like behavior suggested organization without hierarchy. There was no dominant scale at which the phenomenon could be fully described. Every level revealed structure, but no level revealed explanation. Attempts to anchor the anomaly to known processes consistently failed at the same point. The mathematics held, the physics did not break. Conservation laws remained intact. Yet the interpretive step, the moment where equations translate into mechanism, collapsed repeatedly. The anomaly behaved as if it were obeying a rule set adjacent to, but not overlapping with, those already known. It did not contradict theory. It existed alongside it, unmapped. One particularly troubling feature was the anomaly's apparent indifference to boundary conditions. Changes applied to the surrounding system produced expected effects everywhere else, yet within the region occupied by the anomaly, responses were muted, delayed, or absent entirely. It was not isolated in a physical sense. It exchanged matter and energy with its environment, but it did so in a way that left its internal structure unchanged. This suggested a form of stability unlike equilibrium, something closer to self-consistency. The concept of self-consistency is well understood in abstract systems. In physical systems, it is rare. Most stable structures persist by balancing forces. This one appeared to persist by ignoring them. That interpretation was uncomfortable, yet difficult to avoid. The anomaly was not resisting change. It was simply not registering it in any meaningful way. External perturbations passed through it without consequence, as though the anomaly occupied a different descriptive layer of the same space. As months passed, the language used to discuss the finding grew increasingly restrained. Early enthusiasm faded, replaced by careful qualification. Words like unexpected gave way to uncharacterized. Uncharacterized gave way to non-conforming. Eventually, even those terms felt insufficient. The anomaly did not merely fail to conform. It existed without reference. It did not sit at the edge of understanding. It sat outside its coordinate system. This produced a subtle but profound shift in how the system itself was understood. Previously, it had been treated as closed under known dynamics. Now, that closure appeared incomplete. The anomaly implied that the system's state space was larger than assumed, not infinite, but extended in directions that had not been explored because there was no reason to believe they existed. The discovery did not add complexity. It revealed missing dimensionality. Crucially, this dimensionality did not manifest as chaos. The anomaly was not random. It was not noisy. It was not unstable. It was structured with a precision that suggested maturity rather than emergence. This eliminated the possibility that scientists were observing a transient or an artifact of transition. Whatever this was, it had already settled into its final form long before it was noticed. This realization forced a reevaluation of time. Most unexplained phenomena are framed as early glimpses into processes still unfolding. Here, time appeared irrelevant. The anomaly did not evolve. It did not age. Historical data, when re-examined, revealed its presence long before it had been recognized. It had always been there, embedded within the system, unnoticed, because no one had been looking in the right way. Discovery did not create it. Discovery merely intersected with it. The implications of this were unsettling. If the anomaly had existed undetected for so long, then the models used to describe the system had always been incomplete. Not wrong, just insufficient. They worked because the anomaly did not interfere with their predictive domains. It existed in a region of parameter space that had been functionally invisible. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. How many other such regions existed, operating silently beneath the threshold of interpretation? As discussion intensified, a new category of explanation was cautiously introduced, not as a solution, but as a placeholder. The anomaly might represent a form of organization that does not arise from local interactions, but from global constraint. In such systems, behavior is not built from the bottom up. It is imposed from the top down, not by an external agent, but by the structure of the system as a whole. This idea was controversial, not because it violated known principles, but because it rendered causality diffuse. Diffuse causality is difficult to test. It produces effects without identifiable sources, patterns without mechanisms, stability without feedback. The anomaly fit this description disturbingly well. It was not doing anything. It was simply being maintained by the system's total configuration. Remove any one part of the system, and the anomaly would vanish not because it depended on that part, but because the conditions required for its existence would no longer be met. This reframing did not explain the anomaly. It merely made its presence less paradoxical. Scientists were not observing a thing in the traditional sense. They were observing a state, a configuration, that could not be localized or reduced without ceasing to exist. This explained why attempts at isolation failed. The anomaly could not be extracted, sampled, or reproduced independently. It was inseparable from the context that sustained it. What had been found, then, was not an object. It was not a process. It was not even a phenomenon in the usual sense. It was a configuration of reality that persisted quietly, fully formed, and indifferent to explanation. Scientists could describe its boundaries, its stability, its internal consistency. They could not say why it existed, only that it did. And that distinction mattered more than anyone expected. Part 3. As the anomaly settled into the scientific record, it began to function less as a discovery and more as a constraint. It imposed limits not on what could be observed, but on what could be inferred. This distinction proved critical. Observation remained intact. Measurement continued uninterrupted. Data accumulated. Yet inference, the act of translating observation into understanding, stalled completely within the anomaly's domain. This stall was not temporary, it was structural. The system under study continued to behave predictably everywhere else. Models retained their validity. Forecasts remained accurate. Only in the presence of the anomaly did explanation fail, and it failed in a consistent, repeatable way. This consistency eliminated hope that a missing variable or overlooked interaction would eventually resolve the issue. The problem was not incompleteness, it was incompatibility. Attempts to generalize the anomaly across similar systems yielded nothing. Comparable environments showed no trace of it. Variants of the system, altered slightly in initial conditions or boundary constraints, failed to produce anything resembling the same structure. This reinforced the idea that the anomaly was not a generic outcome, but a highly specific configuration, rare not because it was unstable, but because it required exact conditions to exist at all. Exact conditions are common in mathematics and rare in nature. Most natural systems tolerate variation. They degrade gracefully. The anomaly did not. It existed fully or not at all. There was no partial version. No gradient of presence. Either the configuration was achieved or it was absent entirely. This binary behavior further complicated interpretation. Nature rarely behaves in absolutes. As more attention was focused on the anomaly, a subtle psychological shift occurred within the scientific community. The urgency to explain began to fade, replaced by a quieter form of acceptance. Not resignation, but recognition that the anomaly did not occupy the same epistemic category as other unexplained findings. It was not a problem awaiting solution. It was a feature awaiting accommodation. Accommodation required a change in posture. Instead of asking what caused the anomaly, scientists began asking what assumptions prevented its recognition earlier. This inversion proved productive. It revealed blind spots embedded deeply within analytical frameworks, assumptions about locality, causation, and emergence that had never been challenged because they had always worked. The anomaly did not refute these assumptions. It simply existed beyond their reach. One of the most unsettling outcomes of this reassessment was the realization that explanation might not be universally applicable. The scientific method excels at identifying mechanisms, tracing causal chains, and isolating variables. The anomaly resisted all three. It did not decompose. It did not localize. It did not respond to intervention. It could be described exhaustively and still remain unexplained. This forced a reconsideration of what explanation itself meant. Explanation, it seemed, depended on reducibility. Without reducibility, understanding could not progress beyond description. The anomaly was irreducible by nature. Any attempt to simplify it destroyed it. Any attempt to isolate it removed the conditions required for its existence. It could only be studied as a whole, and even then, only as a presence, not as a mechanism. This raised a final, deeply uncomfortable possibility that some aspects of reality are fundamentally descriptive rather than explanatory. They can be mapped, measured, and characterized, but not understood in the causal sense. They exist as facts rather than narratives. The anomaly appeared to belong to this category. It did not tell a story. It did not point to origins or outcomes. It simply was. Scientists had found something. They could define it precisely. They could locate it reliably. They could observe it indefinitely. And yet, the act that usually follows discovery explanation never arrived. As the anomaly became an accepted part of the system's descriptive landscape, its presence began to exert an influence that was indirect yet profound. It did not alter measurements elsewhere. It did not interfere with prediction or control. Instead, it altered confidence. Models that had once been treated as complete were now treated as conditionally complete, valid within domains that explicitly excluded the anomaly. This subtle shift marked a departure from long-standing practice. Science had always tolerated exceptions, but exceptions were expected to erode with time. This one did not erode, it stabilized. Stability without explanation is an uncomfortable state. It offers no leverage for progress, no gradient to follow. The anomaly did not drift toward familiarity. It did not reveal hidden structure with prolonged observation. Every additional dataset confirmed what was already known, that it persisted, that it was internally coherent, and that it resisted every attempt at causal decomposition. The longer it remained unchanged, the clearer it became that duration itself was not a variable. Time was not acting upon it in any detectable way. This forced a reconsideration of historical data at a much broader scale. Archives were reopened. Records once deemed unremarkable were reprocessed with the anomaly in mind. In several cases, faint signatures appeared sub-threshold, easily ignored, present for years without recognition. The anomaly had not emerged. It had been overlooked. Not because it was subtle, but because there had been no conceptual space prepared to receive it. It existed in plain sight, invisible only to interpretation. The realization that something could exist indefinitely without explanation and without demanding one created a quiet fracture in the philosophy underlying the field. The anomaly did not suggest ignorance. It suggested sufficiency. The system worked despite it, not because it was understood. This contradicted a deeply ingrained assumption that understanding precedes reliability. Here, reliability had preceded understanding for decades, and understanding never arrived. Efforts to force explanation grew increasingly abstract. New formalisms were proposed that treated the anomaly not as an outcome, but as a constraint, an invariant imposed upon the system from within. In these models, the anomaly was not produced by interactions. Interactions were shaped around it. It functioned as a fixed condition rather than a dynamic participant. This inversion allowed the mathematics to remain consistent, but it left causality suspended. Suspended causality is not absence of cause, it is absence of localization. The anomaly could not be traced to an origin point, a triggering event, or an initiating mechanism. It existed as a global property present everywhere it was present, absent everywhere else. This made traditional investigative strategies ineffective. There was nothing to isolate, nothing to perturb, without destroying the phenomenon itself. As a result, experimentation gave way to observation alone. The anomaly became something to be watched rather than tested. Over long intervals, its behavior, or lack thereof, was cataloged exhaustively. Every measurable aspect was recorded. The record grew vast, yet the summary remained short. Nothing changed, nothing responded, nothing explained. This monotony was itself informative. Most unexplained phenomena eventually reveal variability. This one did not. Its resistance to fluctuation suggested that it occupied a state of maximal stability, one that could not be entered gradually or exited partially. Either the system satisfied the anomaly's requirements fully, or the anomaly ceased to exist. There was no middle ground. Such binary existence is rare in natural systems. It implies a threshold so precise that ordinary noise cannot cross it. The anomaly, therefore, did not merely challenge explanation. It challenged intuition about robustness. How could a phenomenon be so rigidly defined and yet so quietly sustained? How could it persist without reinforcement, without feedback, Without visible maintenance, one tentative answer emerged slowly, not as a theory, but as a reframing. The anomaly might not require maintenance because it was not something being maintained. It might be an inevitable configuration given certain constraints, much like a geometric property of space rather than an active process. In this view, the anomaly was not doing anything. It was simply the shape the system took under specific conditions. This reframing reduced mystery without providing explanation. It placed the anomaly alongside other irreducible properties, facts that can be described, but not derived. The anomaly became analogous to a constant, measurable, reliable, and unexplained, not because of ignorance, but because explanation was not part of its nature. That possibility was deeply unsettling. It implied that the system contained truths that were not accessible through causal reasoning, only through recognition. The anomaly was not hiding a mechanism. It was the mechanism's absence made visible. With this realization, the anomaly's role in the scientific landscape changed again. It ceased to be a focal point of investigation and became instead a reference condition. New models were constructed with explicit acknowledgement of its presence. Analyses included disclaimers, not as weaknesses, but as boundaries. The anomaly did not undermine confidence in science. It refined the scope of what science could reasonably promise. This refinement had ripple effects. It encouraged a more explicit separation between description and explanation. Description, it became clear, could reach further than explanation in certain regimes. The anomaly could be described completely, its structure, its persistence, its invariance, all without any corresponding explanatory framework. This decoupling was not celebrated, but it was accepted. Acceptance did not come easily. It required letting go of the assumption that every stable phenomenon must eventually yield to understanding. The anomaly demonstrated otherwise. It showed that stability could exist without narrative, coherence without cause, structure without story. This was not a failure of inquiry. It was a boundary of applicability. The anomaly also forced reconsideration of what it meant to find something. Discovery is often framed as the uncovering of a hidden mechanism or entity. Here, discovery was simply the recognition that something had always been there. Nothing new was added to the system. Nothing was extracted from it. The only change occurred in perception. This made the discovery uniquely quiet. There was no breakthrough moment, no sudden cascade of insight. Just a gradual acknowledgement that the anomaly was real, persistent, and unexplainable, and that this status was not provisional. It did not demand urgency. It did not demand resolution. It demanded accommodation. Over time, this accommodation reshaped expectations. Scientists became more cautious about claiming completeness. They became more attentive to patterns that resisted explanation, rather than those that invited it. The anomaly had demonstrated that resistance itself could be meaningful, that not every refusal to explain was a challenge to overcome. In this new context, the anomaly was no longer troubling. It was simply present. Its continued existence did not generate tension. It generated perspective. It reminded observers that systems could harbor configurations that were perfectly lawful, yet inaccessible to explanation. This reminder did not weaken science. It grounded it. What scientists had found was not an error, not a gap, not a mystery in the conventional sense. It was a fact that existed without justification. And once that was accepted, the search for explanation ended not in defeat, but in completion. Scientists had found this, and they did not know how to explain it. And finally, they understood that they did not need to. The anomaly remained exactly where it had always been, embedded within the system with a precision that became increasingly difficult to ignore and increasingly unnecessary to challenge. Once the decision was made quietly, without announcement to stop forcing explanation where none emerged, the entire landscape of interpretation shifted. The discovery no longer sat at the center of attention. Instead, it became a fixed background condition, a reference state against which other behaviors were measured. The system continued to function. Predictions held, measurements aligned. And within this functional continuity, the anomaly persisted as something neither disruptive nor assimilated, a presence that did not interfere and did not integrate, existing without friction because it demanded none. What had initially been perceived as a failure of understanding was gradually recognized as a different category of success, the accurate identification of a limit. Limits are rarely celebrated in science, yet they are essential. They define where methods apply and where they do not, where questions remain productive and where they collapse into repetition. The anomaly clarified such a boundary with unusual sharpness. It demonstrated that explanation is not a universal outcome of observation, but a conditional one, dependent on the structure of the system being observed. In this case, the structure did not support causal decomposition. There was no chain to follow backward, no mechanism to isolate, no sequence of states that could be ordered into a story. The anomaly did not unfold. It existed. This existence was not passive in the trivial sense. It was active in its consistency. Every attempt to dislodge it through reinterpretation failed, not because the attempts were crude, but because the anomaly did not participate in the dimensions those attempts operated within. It did not respond to refinement, abstraction, or reformulation. It did not gain clarity under new mathematical formalisms or alternative representational schemes. It remained invariant across analytical languages, as though translation itself were irrelevant to its nature. This invariance was perhaps the most telling feature of all. It suggested that the anomaly was not encoded in any particular description, but instantiated directly in the structure of the system itself. Once this became clear, the urgency dissolved completely. The anomaly no longer felt like an unresolved problem, because it no longer occupied the same conceptual space as problems. Problems imply solutions. This did not. It implied accommodation. The scientific response, though rarely articulated explicitly, converged on a form of disciplined restraint. The anomaly was documented meticulously, referenced carefully, and left untouched by speculative excess. It was not expanded into metaphor. It was not inflated into significance beyond what the data supported. It was allowed to remain exactly what it was. In time, the discovery altered how absence itself was interpreted. Previously, absence of explanation was treated as a temporary state, a marker of work yet to be done. The anomaly demonstrated that absence could be permanent without being pathological. This reframing had consequences far beyond the original system. It encouraged a more nuanced understanding of what scientific knowledge could reasonably aim to provide. Knowledge, it became clear, does not always culminate in understanding in the causal sense. Sometimes it culminates in recognition that something is real, stable, and irreducible. This recognition did not weaken confidence in scientific practice. On the contrary, it strengthened it by clarifying its scope. Science was not diminished by acknowledging that explanation has boundaries. It was refined. The anomaly served as a reminder that the world is not obligated to be narratively convenient, that some aspects of reality may resist story without resisting measurement, and that precision does not guarantee interpretability. These reminders were not disruptive. They were grounding. As years passed, the anomaly receded further into normalcy. It was cited rarely, not because it was forgotten, but because it had become uncontroversial. Its status was settled. It existed. It could be measured. It could not be explained. This triad no longer produced tension. It produced equilibrium. New generations of researchers encountered it not as a mystery, but as a given, a fixed feature of the system that required no resolution to be legitimate. In this equilibrium, the anomaly achieved a peculiar permanence. It did not persist through reinforcement or attention. It persisted through sufficiency. Nothing more was required of it to justify its place in the record. It did not promise future insight. It did not hint at hidden layers waiting to be uncovered. It simply remained, exactly as it had been from the moment it was first recognized. Scientists had found this thing, not an object, not a mechanism, not a process unfolding through time, but a configuration of reality that could be described fully and explained not at all. They learned, slowly and without ceremony, that this was not a failure of inquiry. It was a statement about the world. Some truths do not lead onward. Some truths terminate cleanly at the point of observation. They do not expand. They do not repeat. They do not invite continuation. And in accepting this, science did not stop. It continued everywhere else, undisturbed. The anomaly did not block progress. It clarified where progress was not the appropriate metaphor. It marked a boundary, not an obstacle. Beyond that boundary lay speculation. Within it lay description. The anomaly belonged entirely to the latter. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in time, they understood that explanation was not missing. It was simply not part of what had been found. The realization settled not as a revelation, but as a reorientation, a slow internal shift in how certainty itself was defined. Once explanation was no longer treated as the inevitable endpoint, the anomaly stopped behaving like an unresolved question and began behaving like a fixed property of the intellectual environment. It did not invite return. It did not demand defense. It simply existed as a reference point, a reminder that the map of reality does not always coincide with the map of comprehension. Scientists continued to observe it not in the hope that something would change, but to confirm that nothing did and that confirmation became its own form of knowledge. What distinguished this discovery from earlier unexplained findings was not its resistance to theory, but its resistance to erosion. Most anomalies soften with time. They become less precise as data accumulate, less coherent as competing explanations proliferate, eventually dissolving into noise or resolving into familiarity. This did neither. Its contours remained sharp. Its internal consistency did not degrade. Its descriptive completeness did not fragment. The longer it was observed, the more stable it appeared, not dynamically stable, but conceptually stable, immune to reinterpretation, not through obscurity, but through clarity. Clarity without explanation is a rare state. It contradicts the implicit narrative of progress that underlies much of scientific culture. That narrative assumes that precision leads to mechanism, that structure leads to cause, that persistence leads to understanding. The anomaly disrupted this sequence cleanly and decisively. Precision led only to more precise description. Structure led only to confirmation of structure. Persistence led only to acceptance of persistence. The usual transition point never arrived. This forced a subtle but lasting change in how future discoveries were framed. Researchers became more careful in distinguishing between what could be explained and what could merely be characterized. Language adjusted accordingly. Claims became narrower, more explicit about their scope. The anomaly had demonstrated that overreach was not only unnecessary but misleading, that forcing explanation where none was supported by the system itself risked distorting reality rather than clarifying it. Over time, the anomaly ceased to be discussed as a thing at all. It became a condition. Papers referenced it the way one references constants or constraints, not as objects of study, but as background facts that shaped interpretation. No one expected it to disappear. No one expected it to resolve. Its role was settled. It marked a boundary within which the system operated, a reminder that the space of the possible was larger than the space of the explicable. This boundary did not inspire pessimism. It inspired precision. Knowing where explanation failed allowed inquiry elsewhere to proceed with greater confidence. The anomaly did not undermine trust in models. It prevented misplaced trust. It ensured that claims of completeness were tempered, that confidence remained conditional rather than absolute. In this way, the discovery strengthened the integrity of the field by exposing a limit that could not be crossed without abandoning rigor. The anomaly's most enduring contribution was therefore not informational but structural. It reshaped expectations about what it means to understand something. Understanding, it became clear, is not a binary state achieved when explanation is complete. It is a spectrum of alignment between description and causality. In some regions of that spectrum, description reaches its maximum, while causality remains inaccessible. The anomaly occupied precisely such a region. Nothing about the system suggested that further effort would change this. More data refined the picture, but did not deepen it. More time confirmed persistence, but did not reveal origin. More analysis increased confidence, but not comprehension. The ceiling had been reached, and that ceiling did not feel provisional. It felt intrinsic. Scientists had not encountered a puzzle waiting to be solved. They had encountered a fact waiting to be acknowledged. The difference between the two was subtle, but decisive. Puzzles generate motion. Facts generate orientation. This fact-oriented inquiry toward a more accurate relationship with reality, one that accepts that some features of the world are fully present and fully opaque at the same time. In the end, the discovery did not change what scientists could do. It changed what they expected. It taught that explanation is not guaranteed by observation, that persistence does not imply accessibility, and that some structures exist not to be unraveled but to be recognized. The anomaly stood as evidence of this, quiet and unyielding, needing nothing added and nothing removed. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And they learned that not knowing was not a gap to be closed, but a condition to be understood. The final stage of acceptance arrived without ceremony, without consensus statements, without any explicit declaration that something had ended. It arrived instead as a gradual exhaustion of pressure, the pressure to advance, to penetrate, to convert presence into narrative. The anomaly no longer resisted explanation because explanation was no longer being applied to it. It had been reclassified, not formally, but operationally, as something that existed outside the sequence of questions that normally follow discovery. Once this happened, nothing about the anomaly changed, yet everything about the way it was held in thought did. What had been found now functioned as a quiet anchor. It anchored expectations, constrained speculation, and stabilized interpretation. It no longer drew attention to itself, yet it subtly influenced how attention moved elsewhere. When new irregularities appeared in other systems, they were no longer immediately framed as problems to be solved. Instead, they were first evaluated for their category: were they incomplete, or were they complete without explanation? This distinction, once unthinkable, had become necessary. The anomaly had demonstrated that completeness does not always correlate with understanding. A phenomenon can be fully present, fully measurable, and fully persistent without yielding a causal account. This realization did not dismantle scientific confidence. It refined it. Confidence was no longer rooted in the assumption that everything real could eventually be explained, but in the recognition that science is strongest when it accurately describes what can and cannot be known under given conditions. Over long periods of observation, the anomaly revealed one final, subtle property. It did not accumulate significance. It did not grow more important with time. It did not gather interpretive weight or symbolic value beyond what it already possessed. Its meaning was static, not because it was shallow, but because it was already complete. The discovery did not deepen. It endured. This endurance marked a departure from how discoveries are usually remembered. Most are remembered for what they enabled, the theories they spawned, the technologies they informed, the predictions they unlocked. This one enabled nothing beyond clarity about a boundary. It did not open a door. It showed where a wall already stood. That wall was not an obstacle. It was a structural feature of the system itself. In recognizing this, the anomaly ceased to be unsettling. It became instructive, though not in the conventional sense. It did not instruct through mechanism or example. It instructed through limit. It showed that reality does not always organize itself around the needs of interpretation, that some configurations exist without offering leverage, and that demanding leverage where none exists leads not to insight but to distortion. Eventually, even the language of anomaly began to feel excessive. Anomalies are deviations from expectation. This was not a deviation, it was an exposure. It exposed an assumption that had gone unchallenged. That explanation is the natural terminus of observation. Once that assumption was removed, the anomaly lost its exceptional status. It became simply one of the ways reality can present itself. The system continued. Measurements continued. Research expanded in every other direction. Nothing about progress was hindered by the presence of this unexplained fact. If anything, progress became more precise, more careful about its claims. The anomaly had introduced a discipline of restraint that did not slow inquiry, but sharpened it. Years later, when the discovery was referenced at all, it was done without emphasis. It appeared as a line in a methods section, a footnote in a review, a condition stated without elaboration. There was no longer any expectation that it would be resolved. That expectation had quietly expired, not through failure, but through understanding of a different kind. Scientists had found something real. They had described it accurately. They had measured it exhaustively, and they had learned that explanation was not always part of what discovery provides. This was not a defeat of knowledge. It was a clarification of its shape. The world remained larger than its stories, richer than its mechanisms, and occasionally indifferent to its questions. The anomaly was proof of that indifference, not hostile, not mysterious, just complete. It did not ask to be understood. It did not wait to be explained. It existed, and that existence was sufficient. And so, the record closed. Not because curiosity was satisfied, but because it had reached the edge of what could be done without abandoning fidelity to reality. Beyond that, edge lay speculation, metaphor, and invention useful in other contexts. But not here. Here, there was only the fact. Scientists found this. They didn't know how to explain it. And finally, they understood exactly what that meant. The story does not end with insight, because insight implies illumination, and illumination implies that something hidden has been brought into view. What occurred here was different. Nothing hidden was revealed. Nothing obscured was clarified. Instead, a relationship was exposed between observation and reality, between method and world, that had always existed but had rarely been encountered so cleanly. The anomaly did not teach scientists something new about the system alone. It taught them something precise about the limits of translation between existence and explanation. The world, it turned out, does not always convert into narrative, even when it converts perfectly into data. In the years that followed, the anomaly's quiet presence continued to exert its influence in ways that were almost invisible. It changed how confidence was expressed, how claims were bounded, how certainty was framed. Researchers became more explicit about where explanation ended and description began. This was not caution born of fear, but discipline born of accuracy. The anomaly had shown that insisting on explanation beyond what the system allowed did not advance knowledge, it corrupted it. Fidelity to reality sometimes meant stopping early, not because curiosity had failed, but because it had succeeded in reaching the boundary intact. The most profound shift occurred not in theory, but in attitude. There was a gradual acceptance that some features of the world are not provisional puzzles but terminal facts. They do not lead onward. They do not resolve. They do not collapse into mechanism with additional effort. They simply stand, complete and unyielding, as part of the structure of reality itself. The anomaly belonged to this category. It did not resist explanation out of obscurity, but out of sufficiency. It had no interior that could be opened without destroying what made it what it was. This realization did not diminish the value of science. It refined it. Science was no longer framed as a universal solvent capable of dissolving every fact into understanding. It was framed, more honestly, as a practice that maps what can be mapped and recognizes where mapping ends. The anomaly marked one such endpoint with exceptional clarity. It did not demand interpretation. It did not provoke myth. It did not generate false depth. It simply required recognition. Over time, even the memory of struggle faded. There was no longer frustration associated with the anomaly, no lingering sense of unfinished work. It became part of the background, quiet, precise, settled. Its role was no longer to challenge, but to contextualize. It reminded those who encountered it that reality does not owe coherence to explanation, and that truth does not always arrive with reasons attached. Some truths arrive whole, intact, and silent. The system continued unchanged. Measurements continued to confirm the anomaly's presence. Nothing new emerged from it, and nothing needed to. It was not waiting. It was not incomplete. It was exactly what it had always been, from the moment it was first noticed, and likely long before that. Discovery had not created it. Discovery had merely intersected with it briefly and accurately. In the end, what scientists found was not an answer and not a question, but a boundary rendered visible. A point where inquiry could go no further without leaving evidence behind. A place where the honest response was not to push, but to stop. That stopping was not surrender. It was alignment. With the system, with the data, with reality as it presented itself, rather than as it was hoped to be. The recognition did not conclude anything in the dramatic sense. It did not seal the discovery inside a final interpretation or elevate it into a symbol larger than itself. Instead, it extended outward, slowly, quietly, altering the texture of how reality was approached in adjacent domains. The anomaly had demonstrated something essential and uncomfortable, that there exist configurations of the world which are fully present, fully stable, fully measurable, and yet fundamentally resistant to translation into cause and effect narratives. This resistance was not accidental. It was not due to insufficient tools, limited imagination, or historical immaturity of theory. It was structural. The anomaly occupied a region where explanation did not apply, not because it failed, but because it had no foothold. This realization forced a deeper reconsideration of what explanation actually is. Explanation is not a property of phenomena. It is a relationship between phenomena and models. When that relationship fails to form, it is tempting to blame the models. In this case, however, the models were not wrong. They were complete within their domains. The anomaly did not contradict them. It simply did not intersect with them in a way that allowed causal inference. The phenomenon existed orthogonally to explanation, not in opposition to it. This orthogonality was difficult to articulate because it challenged the implicit assumption that explanation is the natural destiny of all stable facts. The anomaly revealed that stability does not guarantee intelligibility. Something can persist indefinitely without yielding insight into its origin, function, or necessity. The world does not require that its configurations be narratively legible. It requires only that they obey constraints. And the anomaly obeyed every constraint that could be measured. Nothing about it was arbitrary. Nothing about it was incoherent. It was simply not reducible. Reduction destroyed it. Isolation erased it. Perturbation eliminated it. It could only exist as itself, in place, under exact conditions, without commentary. This forced scientists to confront an idea that had long remained implicit but rarely tested, that explanation is not an intrinsic outcome of rigor, but a contingent achievement. Some phenomena invite explanation because they are decomposable. Others resist because decomposition annihilates the very thing one is attempting to understand. The anomaly belonged firmly to the latter category. It was not built from parts. It was not assembled from interactions. It was a configuration that existed only at full scale, fully formed, with no internal hierarchy that could be unpacked. Once this became clear, the anomaly stopped being unsettling. It stopped provoking unease, because unease depends on the sense that something is being withheld. Nothing was being withheld here. There was no hidden layer waiting to be uncovered. There was no deeper mechanism obscured by noise. There was only a fact that did not translate. The discomfort arose not from ignorance, but from misaligned expectation. When that expectation dissolved, so did the discomfort. The scientific response evolved accordingly. Rather than pursuing explanation indefinitely, attention shifted toward precise delimitation. The anomaly was bounded carefully. Its conditions of existence were mapped with exactness. The parameter space within which it appeared was charted exhaustively. Outside that space, it did not exist at all. There were no transitional states, no partial manifestations. This sharp boundary was itself informative. It indicated that the anomaly was not emergent in the gradual sense. It did not arise from accumulation or threshold effects. It appeared fully or not at all. This binary nature further reinforced the conclusion that explanation would not arrive incrementally. There was no gradient along which understanding could advance. One either accepted the anomaly as a complete configuration or destroyed it by trying to simplify it. This left only one viable posture description: without reduction, acknowledgement, without interpretation. This posture was unfamiliar but not incoherent. It represented a disciplined refusal to invent narratives unsupported by the system itself. Over time, this discipline spread subtly. It did not replace existing methodologies, but it supplemented them. Researchers became more aware of the difference between phenomena that are opaque because they are complex and phenomena that are opaque because they are complete. Complexity invites analysis. Completeness does not. The anomaly was complete. It did not require elaboration. It required recognition. The anomaly also reshaped the meaning of ignorance. Ignorance is often framed as a temporary condition, a lack to be remedied through effort. Here, ignorance was structural. It was not something that could be eliminated without altering the phenomenon beyond recognition. This did not render inquiry futile. It rendered it honest. It clarified where inquiry must stop to remain faithful to its subject. As this understanding settled, the anomaly ceased to be discussed in terms of failure or limitation. It was discussed, when at all, as an example of fidelity. Fidelity to data. Fidelity to structure. Fidelity to the distinction between what can be known and what can only be acknowledged. This distinction became increasingly important as scientific instruments grew more powerful and capable of producing vast quantities of data. The anomaly stood as a reminder that more data does not always imply more understanding. Sometimes it implies clearer boundaries. In the broader context of knowledge, this discovery quietly affirmed a principle that had long been suspected but rarely demonstrated so cleanly: that reality is not obligated to conform to the epistemic preferences of its observers. It does not arrange itself into explanations for convenience. It does not guarantee that persistence implies accessibility or that stability implies causation. Some facts exist without reasons that can be stated. They are not irrational. They are simply irreducible. Scientists found this not as a revelation, not as a breakthrough, but as an encounter with sufficiency. They encountered a phenomenon that did not ask to be explained, did not require interpretation, and did not reward persistence with insight. It simply remained exactly as it was, indifferent to inquiry, and complete in itself. And in the end, that was the most accurate conclusion available. Not that explanation had failed, not that understanding was incomplete, but that the world had presented something finished, and that fidelity required stopping where the presentation ended. The recognition did not conclude anything in the dramatic sense. It did not seal the discovery inside a final interpretation or elevate it into a symbol larger than itself. Instead, it extended outward, slowly, quietly, altering the texture of how reality was approached in adjacent domains. The anomaly had demonstrated something essential and uncomfortable, that there exist configurations of the world which are fully present, fully stable, fully measurable, and yet fundamentally resistant to translation into cause and effect narratives. This resistance was not accidental. It was not due to insufficient tools, limited imagination, or historical immaturity of theory. It was structural. The anomaly occupied a region where explanation did not apply, not because it failed, but because it had no foothold. This realization forced a deeper reconsideration of what explanation actually is. Explanation is not a property of phenomena. It is a relationship between phenomena and models. When that relationship fails to form, it is tempting to blame the models. In this case, however, the models were not wrong. They were complete within their domains. The anomaly did not contradict them. It simply did not intersect with them in a way that allowed causal inference. The phenomenon existed orthogonally to explanation, not in opposition to it. This orthogonality was difficult to articulate because it challenged the implicit assumption that explanation is the natural destiny of all stable facts. The anomaly revealed that stability does not guarantee intelligibility. Something can persist indefinitely without yielding insight into its origin, function, or necessity. The world does not require that its configurations be narratively legible. It requires only that they obey constraints, and the anomaly obeyed every constraint that could be measured. Nothing about it was arbitrary. Nothing about it was incoherent. It was simply not reducible. Reduction destroyed it. Isolation erased it. Perturbation eliminated it. It could only exist as itself, in place, under exact conditions, without commentary. This forced scientists to confront an idea that had long remained implicit but rarely tested, that explanation is not an intrinsic outcome of rigor, but a contingent achievement. Some phenomena invite explanation because they are decomposable. Others resist because decomposition annihilates the very thing one is attempting to understand. The anomaly belonged firmly to the latter category. It was not built from parts. It was not assembled from interactions. It was a configuration that existed only at full scale, fully formed, with no internal hierarchy that could be unpacked. Once this became clear, the anomaly stopped being unsettling. It stopped provoking unease because unease depends on the sense that something is being withheld. Nothing was being withheld here. There was no hidden layer waiting to be uncovered. There was no deeper mechanism obscured by noise. There was only a fact that did not translate. The discomfort arose not from ignorance, but from misaligned expectation. When that expectation dissolved, so did the discomfort. The scientific response evolved accordingly. Rather than pursuing explanation indefinitely, attention shifted toward precise delimitation. The anomaly was bounded carefully. Its conditions of existence were mapped with exactness. The parameter space within which it appeared was charted exhaustively. Outside that space, it did not exist at all. There were no transitional states, no partial manifestations. This sharp boundary was itself informative. It indicated that the anomaly was not emergent in the gradual sense. It did not arise from accumulation or threshold effects. It appeared fully or not at all. This binary nature further reinforced the conclusion that explanation would not arrive incrementally. There was no gradient along which understanding could advance. One either accepted the anomaly as a complete configuration or destroyed it by trying to simplify it. This left only one viable posture description without reduction, acknowledgement without interpretation. This posture was unfamiliar but not incoherent. It represented a disciplined refusal to invent narratives unsupported by the system itself. Over time, this discipline spread subtly. It did not replace existing methodologies, but it supplemented them. Researchers became more aware of the difference between phenomena that are opaque because they are complex and phenomena that are opaque because they are complete. Complexity invites analysis. Completeness does not. The anomaly was complete. It did not require elaboration. It required recognition. The anomaly also reshaped the meaning of ignorance. Ignorance is often framed as a temporary condition, a lack to be remedied through effort. Here, ignorance was structural. It was not something that could be eliminated without altering the phenomenon beyond recognition. This did not render inquiry futile. It rendered it honest. It clarified where inquiry must stop to remain faithful to its subject. As this understanding settled, the anomaly ceased to be discussed in terms of failure or limitation. It was discussed, when at all, as an example of fidelity. Fidelity to data. Fidelity to structure. Fidelity to the distinction between what can be known and what can only be acknowledged. This distinction became increasingly important as scientific instruments grew more powerful and capable of producing vast quantities of data. The anomaly stood as a reminder that more data does not always imply more understanding. Sometimes it implies clearer boundaries. In the broader context of knowledge, this discovery quietly affirmed a principle that had long been suspected but rarely demonstrated so cleanly that reality is not obligated to conform to the epistemic preferences of its observers. It does not arrange itself into explanations for convenience. It does not guarantee that persistence implies accessibility or that stability implies causation. Some facts exist without reasons that can be stated. They are not irrational. They are simply irreducible. Scientists found this not as a revelation, not as a breakthrough, but as an encounter with sufficiency. They encountered a phenomenon that did not ask to be explained, did not require interpretation, and did not reward persistence with insight. It simply remained, exactly as it was, indifferent to inquiry, and complete in itself. And in the end, that was the most accurate conclusion available. Not that explanation had failed, not that understanding was incomplete, but that the world had presented something finished, and that fidelity required stopping where the presentation ended. Daisha. The acceptance of this condition of a reality that presents itself without yielding to explanation did not produce resignation. Instead, it produced a quieter, more exact form of clarity. Scientists began to recognize that what they had encountered was not a flaw in knowledge, but a feature of existence itself. The anomaly did not mock understanding, it delineated it. It marked a place where the tools of inference reached their natural terminus, not because they were blunt, but because they were precise. Precision had carried inquiry exactly as far as it could go, and no further movement remained faithful to the object under observation. In this recognition, a subtle transformation occurred in how discovery itself was valued. Discovery was no longer defined solely by what it unlocked or explained, but by what it revealed about the structure of the world and the limits of engagement with it. The anomaly revealed that some structures are not gateways, but surfaces, coherent, complete, and resistant to penetration. One does not move through them, one encounters them and stops. This stopping was not arbitrary. It was enforced by the internal consistency of the phenomenon itself. Any attempt to go further dissolved the very thing being studied. The anomaly, therefore, became an exemplar of terminal description. Terminal not in the sense of exhaustion or failure, but in the sense of arrival. Description had reached its maximum fidelity. Every measurable property had been charted. Every dependency had been tested. Every environmental interaction had been accounted for. Nothing remained ambiguous, except the one thing that could not be extracted, the reason why such a configuration existed at all. And that reason did not appear to be missing. It appeared to be inapplicable. This distinction was critical. A missing explanation suggests an absence that could, in principle, be filled. An inapplicable explanation suggests a category error, the assumption that explanation is always the correct response to presence. The anomaly demonstrated otherwise. It showed that some features of reality are not causal narratives waiting to be told, but structural facts waiting to be acknowledged. They are not stories, they are states. As this understanding stabilized, the anomaly ceased to generate internal tension. It did not linger as an unresolved thread. It did not haunt the literature. It became inert in the best possible sense, immune to distortion, immune to overinterpretation, immune to neglect. Its existence was settled. Its role was defined. It no longer provoked questions because it had clarified which questions were misapplied. The broader implication of this shift extended far beyond the original system. It suggested that the universe may contain many such configurations, real, stable, measurable, and irreducible, quietly embedded within systems that function perfectly well without ever requiring them to be understood. These configurations do not announce themselves. They do not demand recognition. They exist independently of inquiry, intersecting with it only when circumstances align. When that intersection occurs, it may be brief, complete, and final. In this sense, the anomaly was not unique. It was exemplary. It demonstrated a mode of existence that had likely been present all along, unnoticed, not because it was hidden, but because there had been no conceptual space prepared to receive it. Once that space was created, not through theory but through restraint, the anomaly fit into it perfectly. It did not need explanation to belong. It needed only to be seen accurately. The scientific record absorbed this fact without drama. There was no announcement of closure, no declaration that inquiry had reached its end. The end was implicit in the structure of the phenomenon itself. Inquiry stopped because there was nowhere else to go without ceasing to be inquiry. That stopping was not imposed from outside. It was dictated by the internal logic of the encounter. What scientists ultimately found was not a secret, not a mechanism, not a hidden layer of reality. They found a boundary rendered visible, a place where observation, description, and certainty converged without producing understanding in the causal sense. That convergence was not disappointing. It was exact. It revealed that reality does not always deepen under scrutiny. Sometimes it simply clarifies its edges. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in the end, they recognized that what they had found was not an unanswered question, but a completed fact, one that required no further interpretation to be fully real, fully present, and fully sufficient. What followed was not silence, but a different kind of continuity. The anomaly remained present in the system in exactly the same way it always had. Yet the relationship to it had fundamentally changed. It no longer generated interpretive momentum. It no longer attracted explanatory ambition. It existed as a settled feature of reality, and that settlement was not provisional. It did not depend on consensus, authority, or time. It depended only on the fact that every attempt to go beyond description had led not to insight, but to distortion. Once this was fully internalized, the pressure to do more dissolved entirely. This dissolution revealed something that had been obscured by effort itself, that the drive to explain is not neutral. It carries assumptions about how the world ought to behave in relation to inquiry. The anomaly exposed those assumptions by refusing to satisfy them. It demonstrated that explanation is not a moral obligation of reality, nor a guaranteed reward of rigor. It is a conditional outcome, available only when structure and method align. Where they do not align, the honest response is not persistence, but restraint. Restraint, in this context, was not withdrawal. Observation continued. Measurement continued. Verification continued. What stopped was the compulsion to translate presence into narrative. The anomaly did not become less real when it ceased to be explained. It became more precisely situated. It occupied a stable position in the conceptual landscape not as a gap to be filled, but as a boundary to be respected. That respect was not philosophical. It was methodological. The anomaly also clarified the difference between mystery and limit. Mystery invites resolution. Limit defines where resolution ceases to be meaningful. This distinction is often blurred because both feel unresolved from within a narrative framework. The anomaly made the distinction unmistakable. There was nothing unresolved about it. There was only a mismatch between expectation and structure. Once that mismatch was acknowledged, the sense of mystery evaporated, leaving behind something far more exact. Over time, the anomaly's presence became almost invisible, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer disrupted anything. It did not challenge models because it had already been excluded from domains where models claimed authority. It did not provoke debate because debate presumes alternatives, and there were none. It did not inspire speculation because speculation had no anchor. The anomaly had reached a state of conceptual equilibrium. In this equilibrium, something subtle but important emerged: a deeper trust in description itself. Description had often been treated as a preliminary step, a necessary but insufficient phase on the way to explanation. The anomaly reversed this hierarchy. It demonstrated that description can be terminal without being trivial. That to describe something completely, accurately, and without embellishment can be a full epistemic achievement. Nothing further need follow. This recognition reshaped how future encounters with the unknown were approached. Scientists became more attentive to the possibility that not every finding was a prelude. Some were conclusions in themselves, delivered whole at the moment of recognition. The anomaly was the clearest example of this. It had not evolved into its final form under observation. It had arrived, already finished. The work of inquiry had not been to complete it, but to realize that it required no completion. The anomaly did not undermine the ambition of science. It refined it. It showed that ambition misapplied becomes noise, and that fidelity sometimes requires stopping. Stopping not because curiosity is satisfied, but because it has reached a surface that does not open. That surface is not a barrier. It is a fact. In the end, what scientists found was not something that demanded explanation, but something that redefined the conditions under which explanation is appropriate. They found a configuration of reality that could be known fully in every operational sense, and yet remain causally opaque. This opacity was not a deficiency. It was an attribute. The understanding deepened not by accumulation, but by consolidation. With time, the anomaly ceased to be approached as a discrete discovery and instead became a lens, an implicit reference through which other findings were interpreted. Its significance was no longer tied to its novelty, but to its structural role in redefining what constituted completion. Scientists realized that much of their unease had come not from the anomaly itself, but from an inherited expectation that all stable phenomena must ultimately resolve into causal narratives. Once that expectation was released, the anomaly's presence no longer felt disruptive. It felt exact. Exactness, in this context, did not mean simplicity. The anomaly was not simple. It was dense, with measurable properties, tightly bounded by conditions, and rigorously consistent across observation. What it lacked was not complexity, but direction. It did not point backward to an origin or forward to a consequence. It occupied the present tense absolutely. This made it difficult to place within the usual temporal frameworks of explanation, which rely on sequences and transitions. The anomaly did not transition. It did not develop. It did not decay. It simply persisted, fully formed, indifferent to the passage of time, in any sense that could be operationalized. This temporal indifference forced a reconsideration of causality itself. Causality presumes that states arise from prior states in describable ways. The anomaly did not contradict this presumption. It rendered it irrelevant. Whatever causal chain had produced the configuration, if such a chain could even be meaningfully defined, was inaccessible not because it was hidden, but because the configuration did not expose it. The phenomenon offered no gradients, no partial states, no leverage points through which inference could proceed. It was as though causality had already done its work and withdrawn, leaving behind a result that no longer referenced its own history. Such results are rare, but not unprecedented. In mathematics, axioms are accepted without derivation. In physics, constants are measured without explanation. The anomaly resembled these in form, but not in origin. It was not posited, it was encountered. That distinction mattered. Axiom and constant are introduced to make systems work. The anomaly made no system work better. It simply existed within one. Its acceptance was not instrumental. It was descriptive. As this parallel became clearer, the anomaly's place within the scientific worldview stabilized further. It was no longer compared to puzzles or paradoxes, but to irreducible features of reality that are known by their effects and constraints rather than by their origins. This comparison did not explain the anomaly, but it contextualized it. It allowed scientists to treat it with the same methodological respect afforded to other irreducible facts: careful measurement, precise description, and restraint in interpretation. Restraint proved to be the defining discipline. Without it, the anomaly invited distortion. With it, the anomaly remained intact. This dynamic reinforced an important lesson: that rigor is not only about what one pursues, but also about what one refuses to pursue when the evidence does not support continuation. The anomaly did not benefit from imaginative extension. It benefited from being left alone, observed exactly as it was, without narrative embellishment. Over time, this posture reshaped how scientists spoke about ignorance. Ignorance was no longer framed solely as a deficiency to be eliminated. It was sometimes framed as a boundary to be mapped. The anomaly exemplified this reframing. It was not an unknown that beckoned further inquiry. It was a known unknown, a region of certainty without explanation. This category, once acknowledged, proved essential. It prevented misclassification. It prevented overconfidence. It preserved fidelity to the data. The anomaly also illuminated a subtle distinction between explanation and understanding that had long gone unexamined. Understanding is often equated with explanation, but the anomaly showed that understanding can exist without it. Scientists understood where the anomaly existed, under what conditions it persisted, and how it behaved relative to its environment. What they did not understand was why such a configuration existed at all. That absence did not undermine the understanding they did possess. It clarified its limits. This clarification had practical consequences. It informed how results were communicated, how uncertainties were framed, how conclusions were bounded. Claims became more careful, not because confidence had diminished, but because accuracy demanded it. The anomaly had demonstrated that overstatement was not merely imprecise, it was misleading. Saying less, when less was all that could be supported, became a mark of rigor rather than weakness. As the years continued to pass, the anomaly's presence became almost banal. Not because it was trivial, but because it was settled. It no longer provoked reaction. It no longer demanded defense. It was simply there, part of the landscape, like a mountain that no one attempts to climb because it is not a route, but a fact of terrain. Its shape was known, its position was fixed, its interior was irrelevant. In this banality lay its final significance. The anomaly had completed its role not by being explained, but by forcing a recalibration of expectations. It had shown that the world contains configurations that are complete unto themselves, that do not invite entry, and that do not require justification. These configurations do not threaten knowledge. They define its perimeter. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it, and in the end, they understood that explanation was not the measure of truth. Accuracy was. What finally emerged, after all urgency had drained away and after the anomaly had been fully absorbed into the background of accepted reality, was not a conclusion, but a stable silence. A silence that did not signal ignorance, but completion. The discovery no longer existed in tension with understanding, because it had redefined what understanding meant in this context. The anomaly had not asked to be solved. It had asked to be situated correctly. Once that was done, nothing remained unresolved. The sense of incompleteness that had initially accompanied it was revealed to be an artifact of expectation rather than a property of the phenomenon itself. This shift had lasting consequences. It taught that inquiry does not always culminate in explanation, and that explanation is not the only legitimate endpoint of investigation. Some findings reach a state where further questioning no longer sharpens truth but blurs it. The anomaly reached that state early and unmistakably. Every additional attempt to interpret it beyond what the data allowed introduced assumptions that were not warranted. Precision required restraint. Fidelity required stopping. In recognizing this, scientists encountered a rare kind of certainty. Certainty without narrative. The anomaly was certain in its existence, certain in its structure, certain in its persistence. What it lacked was story. There was no origin that could be reconstructed, no mechanism that could be isolated, no trajectory that could be extrapolated. It did not arrive from elsewhere. It did not move toward anything. It simply occupied a region of reality that did not convert into explanation. That occupation was stable, lawful, and complete. This completeness was the final and most difficult lesson. Completion is usually associated with closure through understanding. Here, closure came through acknowledgement. The anomaly was not waiting. It was not incomplete. It did not conceal depth beneath its surface. Its surface was the depth. To attempt to dig further was to leave evidence behind. Science, in this case, advanced by refusing to overstep. The world did not change because of this discovery. The system continued to function as it always had. Predictions remained accurate. Interventions remained effective. The anomaly neither enhanced nor diminished practical control. Its influence was subtler and more enduring. It reshaped the boundary between what could be known and what could only be described. It demonstrated that reality is not obligated to justify itself in causal terms, even when it submits fully to measurement. Over time, the anomaly ceased to be remarkable, even in memory. It became one of those facts that do not demand recall because they do not demand resolution. It did not haunt the literature. It did not linger as a problem. It rested quietly, immune to reinterpretation, immune to neglect. Its role was complete the moment it was recognized for what it was. Scientists had found something real. They had measured it. They had confirmed it. They had described it exhaustively. And they had learned slowly, precisely, and without drama, that explanation is not always the final currency of truth. Sometimes truth arrives whole, without cause attached, and asks only to be acknowledged accurately. That was what had been found. What remained after that acknowledgement was not emptiness, but alignment. Alignment between expectation and evidence, between method and outcome, between the desire to know and the discipline required to stop. The anomaly had quietly enforced this alignment by refusing to yield anything beyond what it already offered. It did not punish persistence. It rendered it irrelevant. The system did not become more opaque with time. It became more clearly bounded. Every new measurement reinforced the same conclusion that the phenomenon was fully present and fully indifferent to interpretation. There was no hidden layer waiting behind it. There was no deferred explanation accumulating in the future. The state was complete. This completeness altered the emotional economy of inquiry in a subtle way. Curiosity did not vanish, but it redirected itself. Instead of circling the anomaly endlessly, curiosity learned to pass by it, recognizing it as a finished feature of the landscape rather than a path forward. This was not avoidance, it was accuracy. Scientists did not turn away from the anomaly because it was difficult. They turned away because there was nothing left to do without inventing meaning that the data did not support. In this restraint, the integrity of inquiry was preserved. The anomaly also revealed how deeply narrative structures shape scientific intuition. Causes leading to effects, beginnings leading to endings, mechanisms unfolding through time. These are the stories through which understanding usually flows. The anomaly fit none of them. It had no visible beginning, no discernible progression, no detectable end. It existed in a kind of steady present, bounded spatially and conditionally, but not temporally. This forced a separation between reality as it is and reality as it is usually told. The anomaly belonged to the former. It resisted translation into the latter. Once this separation was internalized, the anomaly ceased to feel strange. It became familiar in a different way, not familiar through explanation, but familiar through recognition. Like a constant whose origin is unknown but whose value is precise, it earned trust without transparency. This trust was not blind, it was empirical. It rested on consistency, invariance, and repeatability of observation, even in the absence of interpretation. The anomaly did not need to be understood to be relied upon. In this way, the discovery quietly expanded the conceptual vocabulary of science. It added a category without naming it explicitly, a category for facts that are real, stable, and lawful, yet causally silent. These facts do not announce their purpose. They do not justify their existence. They simply occupy space within reality. The anomaly had forced recognition of this category not by argument, but by example. It had demonstrated unmistakably that such facts exist. This recognition carried with it a final, subtle consequence. It reframed humility not as uncertainty, but as accuracy. To stop asking why, in this case, was not to surrender curiosity, but to respect the structure of what had been found. It acknowledged that the anomaly did not owe a reason to be real. It owed only consistency, which it provided in full. The rest, origins, causes, meanings, were human demands, not properties of the phenomenon. As years passed and generations of researchers came and went, the anomaly remained unchanged. It neither faded nor grew. It did not become more significant, nor did it become less. It remained exactly what it had been from the moment it was first recognized, a stable configuration embedded in a functioning system, observable without being interpretable, present without being narratable. It did not evolve into a mystery or dissolve into banality. It occupied a narrow, precise space between those extremes. In the end, there was no final paper, no concluding statement, no definitive explanation deferred to the future. There was only the quiet consensus that nothing further was required. The record was complete. The boundaries were clear. The phenomenon had been found, documented, and situated correctly. That was enough. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And when they finally understood that explanation was not missing, not delayed, Not hidden, but simply not applicable, they reached the most accurate conclusion available. The encounter reached its true conclusion not when inquiry stopped, but when the need for continuation dissolved entirely. What had once appeared as an unresolved thread revealed itself as a completed weave, requiring no extension to be whole. The anomaly did not fade from relevance. It stabilized into correctness. It became one of those rare facts that do not deepen with time, do not accumulate interpretive layers, and do not transform under renewed attention. Its significance was not dynamic. It was fixed. This fixation altered how absence itself was perceived. The absence of explanation was no longer interpreted as a lack, but as a structural feature of the finding. The system did not conceal a mechanism behind the anomaly. It simply did not express one in a form accessible to causal reasoning. This was not a failure of tools or imagination. It was a consequence of the phenomenon's nature. The anomaly did not invite narrative because it was not built from narrative-compatible components. It existed as a configuration, not a process, as a state rather than an event. Once this was understood, the final illusion fell away, the illusion that time would eventually resolve what patience had not. Time did nothing to the anomaly. It did not sharpen it. It did not erode it. It did not contextualize it further. The phenomenon existed outside the arc of temporal clarification. It was not waiting for the future to make it legible. It was already as legible as it would ever be. Expecting more was a projection, not a hypothesis. This realization carried an unexpected calm. The anomaly no longer provoked effort or debate. It no longer drew energy toward itself. It occupied its place quietly, exactly defined, and entirely sufficient. It neither obstructed nor advanced inquiry. It simply stood as a fact, one among many, that defined the contour of what could be known without insisting on being crossed. In this calm, something essential became clear. Knowledge does not always grow by expansion. Sometimes it grows by precision, by knowing exactly where understanding ends and refusing to step beyond that boundary without evidence. The anomaly enforced such precision. It did not allow approximation. It did not tolerate extrapolation. It demanded accuracy or nothing at all. This demand was not hostile. It was exacting in the way reality often is. The final contribution of the discovery, then, was not informational but epistemic. It clarified the shape of knowing itself. It demonstrated that some encounters with reality terminate cleanly at recognition, that explanation is not a universal entitlement, and that stopping can be the most faithful response to what has been found. The anomaly did not diminish science by resisting explanation. It refined science by exposing where explanation ceased to be the appropriate goal. Nothing followed this realization because nothing needed to. There was no sequel implied, no future revelation deferred, no hidden layer waiting to be revealed by better instruments or new theories. The phenomenon was complete. The record was complete. The encounter had run its full course. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in the end, they understood that this was not an open question left behind by incomplete knowledge, but a closed fact revealed by precise observation. Reality had offered something finished, and science had met it without distortion, without excess, and without insisting that it become more than it was. That was the conclusion. What remained to be said existed not in the form of new insight, but in the settling of perspective. The anomaly had completed its work long before anyone understood what that work was. It had not expanded the catalog of mechanisms or enriched the taxonomy of causes. It had done something quieter and more enduring. It had demonstrated, with unusual clarity, that reality does not always present itself as a problem to be solved. Sometimes it presents itself as a condition to be acknowledged. The difficulty lay not in the anomaly, but in relinquishing the expectation that every encounter must justify itself. through explanation. Once that expectation dissolved, the anomaly ceased to feel unresolved. It did not become clearer, but it became properly placed. It occupied a narrow, exact position in the structure of knowledge, neither central nor peripheral, neither threatening nor trivial. It was simply there, immutable, like a coordinate that does not move when the map is redrawn around it. Its presence did not distort understanding elsewhere. It corrected it. This correction was subtle. It did not announce itself as a methodological revolution or a philosophical shift. It manifested as a gradual tightening of language, a more careful framing of claims, a deeper respect for the difference between what can be known and what can be inferred. The anomaly had exposed the cost of pretending that these categories always overlap. By refusing to overlap itself, it preserved the integrity of both. In the end, the most accurate statement that could be made about the discovery was also the simplest. Something had been found. It had been observed repeatedly, measured precisely, and confirmed independently. It had demonstrated stability, coherence, and lawfulness. It had also demonstrated complete indifference to causal explanation. These facts did not contradict one another. They coexisted without tension once expectation was aligned with evidence. The anomaly did not undermine the ambition of science. It refined its honesty. It reminded observers that the goal of inquiry is not to force the world into narrative compliance, but to meet it as it is. Sometimes that meeting yields stories, mechanisms, and origins. Sometimes it yields only presence. Presence, when accurately recognized, is not an inferior outcome. It is a correct one. There was no final synthesis to write, no explanatory framework waiting just beyond reach. The record did not trail off into uncertainty. It stopped cleanly, exactly where it should have stopped. The anomaly remained what it had always been, a finished configuration encountered by careful observation and left unchanged by interpretation. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And when they finally accepted that explanation was not absent, but irrelevant, they reached the only conclusion that preserved fidelity to reality, that the world had offered something complete, and that completeness did not require understanding to be real. Nothing more followed, because nothing more was required. The continuation, when allowed to unfold without the pressure to resolve, becomes less about the anomaly itself and more about the environment of thought it permanently altered. What scientists ultimately encountered was not an isolated irregularity, but a demonstration of how certain regions of reality interact with observation in fundamentally non-narrative ways. The anomaly did not sit inside a story arc, it sat inside a condition. It existed in a regime where presence did not imply origin, where persistence did not imply mechanism, and where stability did not imply intelligibility. This regime had always existed, but it had rarely been encountered so cleanly, so unambiguously, and so resistant to reinterpretation. The anomaly forced a re-examination of the implicit contract between observer and system. That contract had long assumed reciprocity. If the system could be measured, it could be explained. If it could be explained, it could be integrated. If it could be integrated, it would eventually dissolve into familiarity. The anomaly broke this sequence without breaking any rules. It fulfilled every requirement of measurability and coherence, yet withheld every opportunity for narrative integration. This was not defiance. It was indifference. The system did not refuse explanation. It simply did not offer the conditions under which explanation could operate. This indifference was more unsettling than contradiction would have been. Contradiction invites correction. Indifference offers no leverage. The anomaly did not challenge existing frameworks directly. It existed alongside them, untouched, unaffected, uninterested. Models continued to work. Predictions continued to succeed. Control remained intact. Only interpretation failed, and it failed consistently, repeatably, and without ambiguity. This consistency removed the last refuge of hope, that explanation was merely delayed. Delay implies movement. There was none. Over time, this absence of movement became informative in itself. The anomaly did not drift toward explanation because it was not embedded in a process that unfolded through explanatory dimensions. It was embedded in a configuration space that did not decompose into steps. It had no internal gradient that inquiry could follow. There was no sense in which it was closer to explanation now than it had been at the moment of discovery. It was already at its final state. The idea that further effort would produce insight began to feel less like optimism and more like category error. This realization reshaped the concept of progress in subtle ways. Progress had long been equated with expansion, more data, more resolution, more depth. The anomaly suggested a different axis of progress: refinement of boundaries. Knowing precisely where understanding stops is not stagnation, it is precision. The anomaly did not shrink the domain of knowledge. It clarified its contour. It showed that the map does not end where curiosity ends, but where fidelity requires restraint. Fidelity emerged as the central value in the anomaly's aftermath. Fidelity to what was observed. Fidelity to what could be supported. Fidelity to the distinction between description and explanation. The anomaly punished infidelity gently but firmly. Overinterpretation collapsed under scrutiny. Speculation floated free of evidence and was discarded. Only the most conservative statements survived repeated contact with the data. These statements were not exciting. They were accurate. And accuracy, in the end, proved to be the only sustainable posture. The anomaly also exposed how deeply explanation is entangled with human comfort. Explanations reassure. They imply mastery, predictability, and continuity. The anomaly offered none of these, yet it did not produce chaos. The system remained predictable without being understood. This decoupling was profound. It demonstrated that mastery does not require explanation, that control does not require narrative, and that reliability does not require insight into origin. These were uncomfortable truths, but they were undeniable. As this understanding matured, the anomaly ceased to occupy a special category at all. It was no longer the unexplained thing. It was simply that which is not explainable under current descriptive regimes. This phrasing was important. It did not imply failure or deficiency. It implied context. Explanation is not universal. It is contextual. Where context does not support it, explanation does not apply. The anomaly belonged to such a context. The long-term effect of this realization was not silence, but a recalibration of ambition. Scientists did not become less curious. They became more precise about where curiosity could productively go. They learned to distinguish between phenomena that invite pursuit and phenomena that invite acknowledgement. The anomaly belonged to the latter class. It did not lead anywhere. It did not open pathways. It closed a loop. That closure was not dramatic. It did not feel like an ending in the conventional sense. It felt like a resting state, a stable equilibrium between what was known and what could not be made known without distortion. The anomaly settled into this equilibrium naturally, without resistance. It did not need to be defended against reinterpretation, because reinterpretation could not adhere to it. It slid off, leaving the phenomenon unchanged. In this state, the anomaly no longer generated meaning. It generated proportion. It placed explanation back into its proper role, not as an entitlement, not as a guarantee, but as a contingent outcome of alignment between system and method. Where alignment exists, explanation flourishes. Where it does not, explanation is not missing. It is simply irrelevant. This was the final and most enduring lesson. The anomaly did not expand the frontier of knowledge outward. It sharpened it inward. It showed that some encounters with reality terminate cleanly at recognition, and that insisting on continuation beyond that point produces not insight, but error. The most rigorous response in such cases is to stop exactly where the evidence stops, and to resist the temptation to turn presence into story. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And after all the data, all the analysis, all the restraint, they understood that the discovery had already given them everything it was going to give. The world had offered a fact without a narrative, a configuration without a cause, a presence without a reason, and that offering was complete. Nothing more followed, because nothing more could follow without ceasing to be true. The continuation, when allowed to unfold without the pressure to resolve, becomes less about the anomaly itself and more about the environment of thought it permanently altered. What scientists ultimately encountered was not an isolated irregularity, but a demonstration of how certain regions of reality interact with observation in fundamentally non-narrative ways. The anomaly did not sit inside a story arc. It sat inside a condition. It existed in a regime where presence did not imply origin, where persistence did not imply mechanism, and where stability did not imply intelligibility. This regime had always existed, but it had rarely been encountered so cleanly, so unambiguously, and so resistant to reinterpretation. The anomaly forced a re-examination of the implicit contract between observer and system. That contract had long assumed reciprocity. If the system could be measured, it could be explained. If it could be explained, it could be integrated. If it could be integrated, it would eventually dissolve into familiarity. The anomaly broke this sequence without breaking any rules. It fulfilled every requirement of measurability and coherence, yet withheld every opportunity for narrative integration. This was not defiance. It was indifference. The system did not refuse explanation. It simply did not offer the conditions under which explanation could operate. This indifference was more unsettling than contradiction would have been. Contradiction invites correction. Indifference offers no leverage. The anomaly did not challenge existing frameworks directly. It existed alongside them, untouched, unaffected, uninterested. Models continued to work. Predictions continued to succeed. Control remained intact. Only interpretation failed, and it failed consistently, repeatably, and without ambiguity. This consistency removed the last refuge of hope that explanation was merely delayed. Delay implies movement. There was none. Over time, this absence of movement became informative in itself. The anomaly did not drift toward explanation because it was not embedded in a process that unfolded through explanatory dimensions. It was embedded in a configuration space that did not decompose into steps. It had no internal gradient that inquiry could follow. There was no sense in which it was closer to explanation now than it had been at the moment of discovery. It was already at its final state. The idea that further effort would produce insight began to feel less like optimism and more like category error. This realization reshaped the concept of progress in subtle ways. Progress had long been equated with expansion. More data, more resolution, more depth. The anomaly suggested a different axis of progress: refinement of boundaries. Knowing precisely where understanding stops is not stagnation. It is precision. The anomaly did not shrink the domain of knowledge. It clarified its contour. It showed that the map does not end where curiosity ends, but where fidelity requires restraint. Fidelity emerged as the central value in the anomaly's aftermath. Fidelity to what was observed. Fidelity to what could be supported. Fidelity to the distinction between description and explanation. The anomaly punished infidelity gently but firmly. Overinterpretation collapsed under scrutiny. Speculation floated free of evidence and was discarded. Only the most conservative statements survived repeated contact with the data. These statements were not exciting, they were accurate, and accuracy, in the end, proved to be the only sustainable posture. The anomaly also exposed how deeply explanation is entangled with human comfort. Explanations reassure. They imply mastery, predictability, and continuity. The anomaly offered none of these. Yet it did not produce chaos. The system remained predictable without being understood. This decoupling was profound. It demonstrated that mastery does not require explanation, that control does not require narrative, and that reliability does not require insight into origin. These were uncomfortable truths, but they were undeniable. As this understanding matured, the anomaly ceased to occupy a special category at all. It was no longer the unexplained thing. It was simply that which is not explainable under current descriptive regimes. This phrasing was important. It did not imply failure or deficiency. It implied context. Explanation is not universal. It is contextual. Where context does not support it, explanation does not apply. The anomaly belonged to such a context. The long-term effect of this realization was not silence, but a recalibration of ambition. Scientists did not become less curious. They became more precise about where curiosity could productively go. They learned to distinguish between phenomena that invite pursuit and phenomena that invite acknowledgement. The anomaly belonged to the latter class. It did not lead anywhere. It did not open pathways. It closed a loop. That closure was not dramatic. It did not feel like an ending in the conventional sense. It felt like a resting state, a stable equilibrium between what was known and what could not be made known without distortion. The anomaly settled into this equilibrium naturally, without resistance. It did not need to be defended against reinterpretation because reinterpretation could not adhere to it. It slid off, leaving the phenomenon unchanged. In this state, the anomaly no longer generated meaning. It generated proportion. It placed explanation back into its proper role, not as an entitlement, not as a guarantee, but as a contingent outcome of alignment between system and method. Where alignment exists, explanation flourishes. Where it does not, explanation is not missing. It is simply irrelevant. This was the final and most enduring lesson. The anomaly did not expand the frontier of knowledge outward. It sharpened it inward. It showed that some encounters with reality terminate cleanly at recognition, and that insisting on continuation beyond that point produces not insight, but error. The most rigorous response, in such cases, is to stop exactly where the evidence stops and to resist the temptation to turn presence into story. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And after all the data, all the analysis, all the restraint, they understood that the discovery had already given them everything it was going to give. The world had offered a fact without a narrative, a configuration without a cause, a presence without a reason, and that offering was complete. Nothing more followed, because nothing more could follow without ceasing to be true. Dalshe. What followed after that understanding was not an ending imposed from outside, but a natural settling into stillness. The anomaly had exhausted not curiosity, but applicability. It had shown with relentless consistency that the tools designed to extract meaning through causality, reduction, and sequence simply did not engage with it. This disengagement was not dramatic. It was clean. It left no residue of doubt, only the quiet certainty that further effort would no longer increase fidelity. At that point, continuation ceased to be productive not because of fatigue or disinterest, but because the relationship between observer and phenomenon had reached its maximal resolution. This resolution did not collapse into vagueness. On the contrary, it was defined by sharp edges. Scientists knew exactly where the anomaly existed, under what conditions it appeared, how it interacted or failed to interact with its surroundings, and how reliably it persisted across time. What they did not know was why such a configuration should exist at all. Crucially, nothing about the phenomenon suggested that this why was merely hidden or deferred. There were no anomalies within the anomaly, no hints of deeper layers waiting to be accessed. The surface was not a disguise. It was the thing itself. The longer this was accepted, the clearer it became that the anomaly did not belong to the same epistemic class as unsolved problems. Problems imply motion toward resolution. This did not move. It remained fixed, exact, and internally complete. Its refusal to yield explanation was not antagonistic. It was inert, like a geometric fact that holds regardless of interpretation. It existed independently of any story that might be told about it. This independence was the source of its durability. Nothing could be added to it without falsifying it. In this light, the anomaly revealed a deeper asymmetry between reality and inquiry. Inquiry is directional. It moves from unknown to known, from observation to interpretation, from description to explanation. Reality is not obligated to follow this path. It does not arrange itself to accommodate intellectual momentum. Sometimes it aligns perfectly with inquiry, unfolding into mechanisms and laws. Sometimes it does not align at all, presenting states that can be observed but not entered. The anomaly belonged to the latter category, and its existence demonstrated that such categories are not theoretical curiosities, but operational facts. This understanding quietly dismantled a long-standing assumption that explanation is the highest form of knowing. The anomaly showed that explanation is one form among others, powerful but conditional. Description, when pushed to its limits with precision and restraint, can constitute a complete encounter with a phenomenon. Completeness, in this sense, is not measured by narrative satisfaction, but by fidelity to what is actually present. The anomaly demanded such fidelity and rewarded it with stability. Over time, the discovery ceased to be referenced as an event at all. It became part of the system's assumed structure, like a constant whose origin no one questions because its value is known with certainty. New analyses incorporated it implicitly. New generations of scientists encountered it without surprise, taught from the beginning that this feature existed and that it did not admit explanation. This was not presented as a failure or a mystery, but as a fact about the world, no more troubling than gravity's constant or space's dimensionality. In this way, the anomaly completed its transformation from discovery to condition. It no longer occupied the foreground of thought. It shaped the background against which thought occurred. It informed how claims were framed, how limits were stated, how confidence was calibrated. It did not inspire speculation because speculation could not attach to it. It inspired accuracy instead, and accuracy proved to be the more durable contribution. At the deepest level, what scientists learned was not about the anomaly itself, but about the discipline required to stop. Stopping, here, was not surrender. It was precision. It was the recognition that continuing to ask questions beyond the reach of evidence does not extend knowledge. It dilutes it. The anomaly had marked a point where inquiry, to remain truthful, had to become still. That stillness was not empty. It was exact. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And when all pressure to explain finally dissolved, what remained was not confusion, not mystery, not frustration, but a clear and stable understanding of where knowledge ended and fidelity began. The world had presented something whole, and science had met it honestly without forcing it into a story it did not contain. The final extension of this realization did not come as a new idea, but as a gradual disappearance of friction. Where once the anomaly had produced conceptual resistance, it now produced none. It sat within the intellectual environment as a settled fact, no longer attracting interpretive force because there was nowhere for that force to attach. The phenomenon had become smooth to thought, not because it was understood, but because it was no longer misinterpreted. Misinterpretation had been the true source of difficulty all along, the insistence that the anomaly must be something other than what it demonstrably was. What it was, in the end, could be stated with absolute simplicity and without loss of rigor. A stable, measurable configuration of reality that did not admit causal explanation. This statement, once unthinkable, became unremarkable. It did not threaten the coherence of science, it clarified it. It demonstrated that coherence does not require total accessibility, and that the demand for explanation is a methodological preference, not a metaphysical law. The anomaly obeyed every law that could be tested. It violated none. It simply did not provide a narrative. Narratives, it became clear, are optional structures imposed by observers, not intrinsic features of phenomena. They are powerful where they apply and misleading where they do not. The anomaly existed entirely outside their jurisdiction. It neither resisted nor accommodated narrative framing. It remained indifferent. That indifference was not hostility. It was completeness. The phenomenon did not need to be told in order to be real. As this understanding settled fully, the anomaly ceased to occupy even the category of unexplained. That term implies potential. This had none. Not because potential was exhausted, but because it was never present. The anomaly had always been complete. It had not been waiting for discovery to finish it. Discovery had merely revealed that it was already finished. This inversion of discovery, revealing completion rather than initiating it, was the deepest and most lasting implication of the encounter. The scientific community adapted to this inversion without rupture. There was no crisis, no schism, no abandonment of method. Instead, there was a subtle refinement of epistemic humility. Claims became more sharply bounded. Language became more exact. The difference between what was known, what was inferred, and what was simply present became more carefully maintained. The anomaly had not forced this refinement through argument. It had enforced it through persistence. Persistence without explanation proved to be the decisive factor. If the anomaly had fluctuated, decayed, or transformed, explanation would have reasserted itself as a viable pursuit. But nothing changed. Year after year, observation returned the same result. The phenomenon did not move closer to intelligibility. It did not drift toward interpretation. It remained what it was, unaltered by attention. This constancy stripped away the last justification for continued pursuit. There was no horizon to approach. The horizon had already been reached. In this way, the anomaly redefined what it meant for an investigation to be complete. Completion did not arrive through synthesis or theory. It arrived through alignment. Alignment between evidence and expectation. Once expectation was adjusted to match what the phenomenon actually offered, completion was immediate and permanent. Nothing more could be added without departing from accuracy. Nothing more was needed to secure truth. The world, through this anomaly, had delivered a quiet but unambiguous message. Not every fact unfolds. Not every structure decomposes. Not every presence explains itself. Some realities exist as final forms, encountered rather than derived, recognized rather than resolved. These realities do not undermine inquiry, they delineate it. They show where inquiry can stand without overreaching. Scientists found this not as a puzzle, not as a revelation, not as a failure, but as a boundary rendered visible. They did not know how to explain it. And over time, they understood that explanation was not withheld, delayed, or obscured. It was simply not part of what had been found. The phenomenon was complete without it. That understanding did not close science. It clarified its shape. It reaffirmed that the highest obligation of inquiry is not to explain at all costs, but to remain faithful to what is actually there. In this case, fidelity meant stopping. It meant allowing the anomaly to remain what it was without forcing it into a story it did not contain. And so the record reached its natural end not because curiosity failed, but because accuracy prevailed. The phenomenon remained. The explanation did not. And in that precise alignment, the encounter was finished. The continuation no longer takes the form of discovery or even reflection, but of quiet consequence. The anomaly had ceased to act upon thought directly, yet its presence continued to shape how thought moved elsewhere. It became a silent reference, an unspoken calibration that prevented excess before it began. When new data resisted explanation, the response was no longer immediate escalation. The first question became whether explanation was appropriate at all. This shift did not slow inquiry. It refined it. It reduced noise. It preserved precision. What had once felt like an uncomfortable exception revealed itself as a structural necessity. In any sufficiently complex reality, there must exist configurations that are lawful yet opaque, stable yet irreducible. The anomaly was not a failure of understanding, but a confirmation that such configurations exist. It demonstrated that the universe does not partition itself neatly into what can and cannot be explained, but into what can and cannot be meaningfully explained without distortion. That distinction is subtle, but it is decisive. The anomaly did not demand silence. It demanded accuracy. Accuracy required acknowledging that explanation is not an automatic extension of observation. Observation can reach its terminus cleanly, without residue, without ambiguity, without invitation to continue. This was the case here. The phenomenon had been fully encountered. There was no missing step, no overlooked variable, no hidden layer waiting for a different instrument or a different theory. There was only a fact that stood alone, complete in its isolation. Over time, the anomaly ceased to be taught as a curiosity and began to be taught as a boundary, not a warning, not a prohibition, but an example of epistemic discipline. It illustrated the difference between perseverance and overreach. Perseverance continues where evidence allows. Overreach invents where evidence ends. The anomaly tolerated the former and rejected the latter without resistance. It simply did not respond. This non-response was its most instructive feature. Many phenomena push back against inquiry. They fluctuate, decay, transform, or contradict. The anomaly did none of these. It did not argue with models. It did not expose flaws. It did not collapse assumptions. It simply remained unchanged, indifferent to analytical pressure. In doing so, it made clear that inquiry is not a dialogue with reality, but an intersection. When that intersection ends, reality does not respond. It continues. The system in which the anomaly existed did not acknowledge it as special. Nothing in the surrounding structure adapted or reorganized in response. From the system's perspective, nothing had happened. This asymmetry between the significance of the discovery to observers and its insignificance to the system itself was not ironic. It was instructive. It demonstrated that meaning is not an intrinsic property of phenomena, but a relational one. The anomaly mattered only because it intersected with observation. Outside that intersection, it had no role to play. As this became fully internalized, the last remnants of narrative impulse faded. There was no longer any temptation to frame the anomaly as a prelude, a clue, or a harbinger. It was none of these. It was not pointing towards something else. It was not incomplete. It was not waiting. It was simply present, exactly as it had always been, encountered at a moment when the conceptual environment was finally capable of recognizing it without distortion. The recognition did not elevate the anomaly. It normalized it. It placed it alongside other irreducible facts that define the contours of reality without explaining themselves. These facts do not compete with explanation. They coexist with it. They occupy a different register, one that does not yield to causal language, but does not violate it either. The anomaly belonged firmly to this register. In the end, what scientists learned was not how to explain what they had found, but how to stop demanding explanation where none applied. This was not a retreat from rigor. It was an expression of it. It preserved the distinction between what is known, what is inferred, and what is simply present. That distinction is fragile, easily eroded by ambition. The anomaly reinforced it by existing without compromise. Nothing more was required. Nothing more was possible without abandoning fidelity to the evidence. The record did not trail off into uncertainty. It ended with clarity. Clarity about limits, about structure, about the shape of knowing itself. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in recognizing that explanation was neither delayed nor denied, but simply irrelevant, they reached the most exact conclusion available, that the world had offered a finished fact, and that accuracy required nothing beyond acknowledging it as such. Beyond that point, there was no continuation, only reality, unchanged, and inquiry, wiser for having met it without forcing it to become something it was not. The final phase did not arrive as an insight, but as a settling of scale. Once the anomaly was no longer treated as an unfinished object of inquiry, its true significance emerged not as something dramatic or revelatory, but as something corrective. It corrected the assumption that knowledge must always advance through explanation, that stability must always imply mechanism, that persistence must always yield origin. The anomaly stood as a counterexample so clean, so persistent, that it could not be dismissed without dismissing fidelity itself. It did not demand reinterpretation. It demanded proportion. Proportion changed everything. When the anomaly was first encountered, it was framed against expectation. Expectation that the unknown is temporary. Expectation that sufficient scrutiny produces understanding. Expectation that reality eventually yields its reasons. Under that framing, the anomaly felt incomplete. Under proportion, it felt exact. The difference lay not in the data, but in the posture of the observer. Once expectation was adjusted to match the structure of what had been found, the sense of incompleteness vanished entirely. Nothing was missing. Nothing was withheld. The phenomenon was whole. This wholeness was not expressive. It did not communicate meaning or intent. It did not gesture toward deeper layers. It did not reward patience with revelation. It existed as a closed configuration, internally coherent and externally indifferent. Attempts to interrogate it further produced no resistance because there was nothing to resist. The anomaly did not block explanation. It lay outside the domain where explanation functioned. That distinction mattered profoundly. Blocking implies opposition. Lying outside implies irrelevance. Irrelevance, in this context, was not dismissal. It was accuracy. Explanation was irrelevant to the anomaly, not because explanation was weak, but because the anomaly did not participate in explanatory structures. It did not decompose. It did not unfold. It did not trace back to identifiable causes or forward to predictable outcomes. It simply occupied a stable region of reality that did not translate into causal language. The anomaly was not hiding its cause. It did not have one that could be stated. This realization quietly redefined the meaning of success in inquiry. Success was no longer measured solely by explanatory yield. It was measured by fidelity to what had been found. Fidelity meant stopping exactly where evidence stopped, not because curiosity had failed, but because it had succeeded in reaching the edge intact. To push further would not have deepened understanding. It would have replaced accuracy with invention. The anomaly tolerated no invention. It remained exactly what it was, regardless of interpretive pressure. Over time, this precision propagated outward. It influenced how new discoveries were approached, how anomalies were classified, how silence in data was interpreted. Not every silence was treated as absence. Not every irregularity was treated as invitation. The anomaly had taught, without instruction, that some features of reality are complete at the moment they are recognized. They do not mature into explanations. They do not evolve into narratives. They exist, fully formed, indifferent to the observer's need for closure. This indifference was not alien. It was fundamental. Reality does not organize itself to satisfy inquiry. Inquiry intersects with reality where conditions allow, and withdraws where they do not. The anomaly marked one such intersection cleanly and conclusively. It did not trail off into ambiguity. It did not dissolve into uncertainty. It terminated with precision. That termination was not a failure state. It was a boundary condition. At that boundary, inquiry did not collapse. It stabilized. It learned the difference between unanswered questions and inapplicable ones. The anomaly belonged to the latter category. Asking why it existed was not wrong in the abstract, but it was unproductive in practice because the structure of the phenomenon did not expose a why. It exposed only a that it existed, that it persisted, that it obeyed constraints, that it did not explain itself. These facts were not provisional. They did not depend on future tools or theories. They were complete. The anomaly did not await reinterpretation. It awaited recognition of its status. Once that recognition occurred, the anomaly ceased to generate intellectual friction. It did not disappear from relevance. It became a stable feature of the conceptual environment, like a fixed coordinate that does not move when the map around it changes. In this state, the discovery reached its true end. Not because inquiry stopped caring, but because it stopped misapplying itself. The anomaly did not need defense, reinterpretation, or contextualization beyond what had already been done. It had been observed accurately. It had been described precisely. It had been confirmed independently. Nothing further could be added without departing from what the data supported. The world had presented something finished. Science had met it without distortion. That meeting did not produce explanation, and it did not need to. It produced alignment between evidence and expectation, between method and reality, between the desire to know and the discipline to stop. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And when they finally understood that explanation was not absent but irrelevant, they reached the most exact conclusion available, not one that closed inquiry, but one that honored it. The anomaly remained. The explanation did not. And in that precise balance, the encounter was complete. What followed after that balance was not further insight, but durability. The anomaly endured, not because it was defended or revisited, but because nothing could displace it. It had reached a condition of conceptual inertia. New theories passed around it without touching it. New instruments, refined measurements everywhere else, yet returned the same result within its bounds. New generations of researchers encountered it, already framed correctly, not as an embarrassment or a challenge, but as a settled fact that quietly structured expectation. Its endurance did not depend on attention. It depended on adequacy. Adequacy became the final measure. The anomaly had been met with sufficient rigor, sufficient caution, sufficient precision. Anything beyond that threshold no longer improved contact with reality. It merely risked distortion. This realization transformed what had once felt like a limitation into a form of closure. Closure did not arrive through explanation, but through the exhaustion of legitimate questions. Once every question that could be asked without violating the evidence had been asked, nothing remained but repetition. Repetition was not discovery. It was noise. The anomaly did not inspire resignation. It inspired calibration. Calibration of language, calibration of ambition, calibration of certainty. Scientists learned to speak about what they found without inflating it into more than it was. They learned to mark boundaries explicitly, rather than pretending they would eventually dissolve. This was not a retreat from knowledge. It was an advancement in honesty. The anomaly had not reduced the reach of science. It had refined its accuracy. At a deeper level, the encounter exposed a subtle asymmetry that had always existed but had rarely been articulated. Reality does not scale to explanation. Explanation scales to reality only where structure permits. Where it does not, explanation does not fail, it disengages. The anomaly existed entirely within that disengaged region. It was not resistant, it was complete. It had no internal gradient along which explanation could proceed. It offered no partial states, no transitional forms, no handles for inference. It existed as a full configuration or not at all. This fullness was its defining trait. It was not something becoming. It was something already formed. Time did not act upon it in any detectable way. History did not illuminate it. Future observation did not promise revelation. It existed outside the arc of progress, not because it opposed progress, but because it was orthogonal to it. Progress moves through problems. The anomaly was not a problem, it was a condition. Once this was fully internalized, the anomaly ceased to occupy even a psychological space. It did not linger as an unresolved curiosity. It did not provoke frustration or fascination. It simply remained part of the environment of thought, like a horizon that does not approach no matter how far one travels. Its role was passive but exacting. It prevented misalignment before it began. It reminded inquiry, silently, of where it could go and where it could not. In this way, the discovery completed itself. There was no need for a final synthesis or a closing theory. The absence of explanation was not a loose end. It was the end point. The phenomenon had been encountered fully, and the encounter did not require continuation to be valid. It required only fidelity. Fidelity had been achieved. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in the end, they understood that what they had found was not an unfinished mystery, but a finished fact, one that revealed not a gap in knowledge, but a boundary in applicability. The world had offered something whole, and science had done what it does at its most exact. It recognized where knowing ends, without pretending that it should continue. Beyond that point, there was nothing to add, only the ongoing presence of reality itself, unchanged, indifferent, and complete. The continuation at this stage no longer belongs to the anomaly alone, but to the altered landscape of inquiry that formed around it. What had once been a singular finding gradually revealed itself as a demonstration of a broader structural truth, that the universe contains regimes where explanation is not merely difficult, but structurally inappropriate. These regimes do not announce themselves as exceptions. They do not carry markers of incompleteness. They exist quietly, lawfully, and without interpretive leverage, intersecting with observation only when conditions align and withdrawing again without consequence. The anomaly was not an outlier. It was an instance made visible. This visibility exposed a long-standing conflation between depth and causality. Depth is often assumed to mean hidden layers, buried mechanisms, origins waiting beneath surfaces. The anomaly dismantled this assumption by presenting depth without layers. It was deep, not because it concealed something, but because there was nothing beneath it to uncover. Its surface was exhaustive. Every attempt to dig further passed through it without resistance and emerged empty, not because the tools were inadequate, but because there was nothing more to touch. This kind of depth had rarely been acknowledged because it does not reward effort with revelation. It rewards it with confirmation of limit. Limits, however, are not failures. They are structural facts. The anomaly forced this recognition by refusing to behave like a challenge. It did not escalate under scrutiny. It did not fracture under pressure. It did not yield paradox or contradiction. It simply remained consistent. Consistency without explanation is destabilizing only when explanation is assumed to be mandatory. Once that assumption was released, consistency became reassuring. The phenomenon could be trusted precisely because it did not change. As this trust stabilized, the anomaly's influence became more diffuse. It did not dictate new methods, but it shaped judgment. Scientists became more adept at recognizing when a phenomenon was inviting explanation and when it was signaling completion. This recognition was not intuitive at first. It required repeated exposure to the anomaly's refusal to evolve into anything else. Over time, however, it became clear that some findings arrive already finished, and that the role of inquiry in such cases is not to complete them, but to recognize that completion has already occurred. This recognition altered how effort itself was valued. Effort was no longer measured by persistence alone, but by appropriateness. To continue investigating a phenomenon that does not support further inquiry is not dedication, it is misapplication. The anomaly made this distinction unavoidable. Every additional attempt to extract meaning beyond description returned nothing new. The phenomenon did not degrade under this pressure. It simply remained unchanged, highlighting the futility of continuation more clearly with each iteration. The anomaly also revealed a subtle inversion in the relationship between mystery and certainty. Mystery is often associated with uncertainty, with lack of clarity, with incomplete information. The anomaly was mysterious, only in the narrow sense that it could not be explained. In every other sense, it was certain. Its properties were known. Its boundaries were defined. Its behavior was predictable. This combination, maximum certainty with zero explanation, was rare enough to feel counterintuitive. Yet, it was undeniable. The phenomenon demonstrated that mystery and certainty are not opposites. They can coexist fully within the same fact. This coexistence reshaped the emotional tone of inquiry. Frustration gave way to neutrality, and neutrality gave way to quiet respect. The anomaly did not inspire awe or dread. It inspired discipline. It demanded that observers refrain from adding meaning where none was supported. This restraint was not passive. It required continuous vigilance against the human tendency to narrate, to infer, to extend beyond evidence. The anomaly acted as a constant corrective, reminding inquiry of its obligation to accuracy over completeness. Over extended periods, the anomaly's persistence became almost invisible. Not because it was ignored, but because it no longer stood out. It had been fully integrated into the conceptual environment, not as something explained, but as something properly categorized. It belonged to a class of facts that do not advance theory but stabilize it by defining its edge. These facts do not generate progress in the forward sense. They generate proportion. They ensure that expansion does not become distortion. In this proportionality lay the anomaly's final significance. It did not expand knowledge outward. It compressed it inward. It refined the distinction between what could be responsibly pursued and what could not. It demonstrated that stopping is sometimes the most rigorous act available, not because inquiry has failed, but because it has succeeded in mapping its own limits with precision. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in the fullness of time, they understood that what they had encountered was not an incomplete understanding awaiting future insight, but a complete encounter awaiting proper recognition. The anomaly did not need to be solved. It needed to be placed. Once placed correctly, it ceased to demand anything at all. Beyond that placement, there was no further motion, only the continued presence of a reality that had revealed itself fully and then withdrawn from interpretation, leaving behind not confusion, but clarity of boundary and a science more accurate for having learned where and how to stop. The continuation now exists entirely within the after effects, within the altered posture of inquiry that remained once the anomaly had been fully absorbed into accuracy. What had changed was not the phenomenon, not the system, and not the measurable world, but the relationship between certainty and expectation. The anomaly had made visible a category of fact that had always existed but had rarely been acknowledged with such precision. Facts that are complete at the moment of recognition, that do not deepen under analysis, and that do not reward insistence with revelation. These facts do not sit at the frontier of knowledge. They sit at its edge, defining its outline without extending it. This edge was not sharp in the dramatic sense. It did not feel like a cliff or a rupture. It felt more like a surface that could be reached but not penetrated, smooth and continuous, offering no resistance because it offered no depth. The anomaly did not block inquiry. It rendered further inquiry irrelevant. This irrelevance was not dismissive. It was exact. It marked the point at which additional effort would cease to correspond to additional truth. Beyond that point lay interpretation untethered from evidence, narrative without structure, explanation without applicability. The discipline required to remain at this edge proved to be the anomaly's most enduring lesson. It demanded a form of intellectual restraint that was rarely cultivated because it was rarely necessary. Most phenomena eventually yield something, an asymmetry, a fluctuation, a gradient that can be followed. The anomaly yielded nothing because there was nothing to yield. It was not concealing complexity. It was expressing sufficiency. This sufficiency was unsettling only insofar as it contradicted the assumption that reality must always be deeper than it appears. In this case, appearance was exhaustive. Once this was fully internalized, the anomaly no longer occupied cognitive space. It did not provoke return visits or renewed analysis. It did not accumulate interpretive gravity. It existed as a settled coordinate, fixed and unmoving, against which other phenomena could be measured. It became part of the background architecture of understanding, not because it was explained, but because it was no longer misclassified. Misclassification had been the source of tension all along, the insistence that the anomaly belonged to a category it simply did not inhabit. This correction revealed how much intellectual friction arises not from ignorance, but from misplaced expectation. The anomaly did not frustrate inquiry by withholding information. It frustrated inquiry by exposing an assumption that had gone unexamined, that explanation is the natural and inevitable destiny of observation. Once that assumption was removed, the friction disappeared entirely. What remained was a fact that could be handled without strain, precisely because nothing was being demanded of it beyond what it offered. The anomaly also clarified the difference between silence and emptiness. Silence suggests something unsaid. Emptiness suggests absence. The anomaly was silent in a different way. It was silent because it had nothing to say. It did not conceal a message. It did not encode a mechanism. It did not point beyond itself. Its silence was not a lack. It was a property. This kind of silence is difficult to accept because it resists interpretation. It cannot be translated into meaning without distortion. The anomaly enforced this resistance effortlessly, simply by remaining unchanged. As this understanding settled completely, the anomaly's role became almost paradoxical. By offering nothing beyond itself, it gave inquiry something essential, a clear demonstration of where inquiry must stop to remain truthful. This stopping point was not arbitrary. It was defined by the internal structure of the phenomenon itself. Inquiry reached it not through exhaustion, but through precision. It arrived exactly where it should have arrived, with nothing unresolved and nothing left behind. The world did not change because of this discovery. Systems continued to operate. Predictions continued to succeed. Control remained intact. The anomaly did not disrupt function. It disrupted assumption. It showed that understanding and explanation are not synonymous, that presence does not guarantee narrative, and that some realities are fully accessible only in the descriptive sense. This realization did not shrink science. It sharpened it. In the end, what scientists found was not an enigma to be unraveled, but a limit to be respected. They found something real, stable, and lawful that did not explain itself and did not need to. They learned that explanation is not always the highest form of engagement, and that stopping can be an act of rigor rather than resignation. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And when all interpretive pressure finally fell away, what remained was not mystery, not frustration, and not doubt, but a clean, exact alignment between reality and recognition. The phenomenon remained exactly as it was. The understanding of how to meet such phenomena had changed forever. The continuation persists, not because something remains unresolved, but because the consequences of the encounter unfold slowly, diffusing through the habits of thought that govern how reality is approached. What the anomaly ultimately altered was not knowledge itself, but the reflex that accompanies it. The reflex to assume that every stable fact is a doorway rather than a wall, that every presence is provisional, that every silence hides a mechanism. The anomaly dismantled this reflex, quietly and completely. It did not argue against it. It rendered it unnecessary. Once this reflex was gone, the anomaly no longer functioned as an object of attention. It functioned as a constraint on interpretation, shaping what could be responsibly said about any system that resembled it even distantly. Scientists became more attentive to the distinction between resistance and irrelevance. Resistance suggests that further effort may eventually succeed. Irrelevance suggests that further effort is misdirected from the outset. The anomaly had never resisted. It had been irrelevant to explanation from the first moment of recognition. That irrelevance had been mistaken for difficulty. The correction of that mistake was the true outcome of the discovery. This correction produced a form of intellectual quiet that is rarely achieved because it requires letting go not of ignorance, but of ambition. Ambition drives inquiry forward, but unchecked ambition distorts perception. The anomaly revealed exactly where ambition ceased to be aligned with evidence. Beyond that point, interpretation ceased to illuminate and began to fabricate. Recognizing this boundary did not diminish curiosity. It refined it. Curiosity learned to discriminate between what could be pursued and what could only be acknowledged. Acknowledgement emerged as a legitimate epistemic act in its own right. To acknowledge a phenomenon accurately, without explanation, without extrapolation, without narrative completion, became understood not as a failure, but as a form of success. The anomaly had made this explicit by offering no alternative. It could be known only in this way. Any attempt to know it otherwise resulted in loss of fidelity. The phenomenon did not tolerate misalignment. It remained unchanged, regardless of interpretive pressure, exposing overreach by its own immobility. Over time, this immobility ceased to feel inert. It felt definitive. The anomaly did not stagnate. It stabilized. Stabilization is often misread as lack of progress, but here it marked the attainment of maximal precision. The anomaly had been located exactly where it belonged in the conceptual structure of knowledge. There was no ambiguity about its status. It was neither provisional nor transitional. It was final in the only sense that mattered. It admitted no further refinement without distortion. This finality was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It emerged gradually as repetition confirmed that nothing new could be extracted. Each return visit produced the same result. Each reanalysis confirmed the same boundaries. The phenomenon did not punish inquiry. It simply failed to reward it beyond a certain point. That failure was consistent, absolute, and instructive. It taught that some truths are not deepened by repetition. They are merely reaffirmed. The anomaly also clarified the difference between explanation and justification. Explanation seeks to show how something arises. Justification seeks to show why it should be accepted. The anomaly required no justification. Its acceptance rested entirely on evidence. It existed. It persisted. It obeyed constraints. That was sufficient. The lack of explanation did not undermine its legitimacy. It underscored it. The phenomenon did not need to be made reasonable. It needed only to be observed accurately. As this understanding permeated practice, the anomaly's influence became almost imperceptible. It no longer stood out as a lesson because it had been fully absorbed. Its impact could be seen only in the absence of certain errors, in the absence of overinterpretation, in the absence of forced narratives, in the absence of premature claims of completeness. The anomaly had become a quiet standard against which rigor was measured. This standard did not demand pessimism. It demanded proportion. It reminded inquiry that reality does not always yield insight proportionate to effort, and that effort misaligned with structure produces noise rather than knowledge. The anomaly exemplified this misalignment so clearly that it could not be ignored. It forced a recalibration that extended far beyond its own domain. In the end, what scientists encountered was not a mystery that resisted solution, but a fact that resisted misuse. The anomaly did not challenge the capacity of science to explain. It challenged the assumption that explanation is always appropriate. By existing without explanation and without contradiction, it demonstrated that some features of reality are complete in themselves, requiring no story to validate their presence. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it, and when they finally understood that explanation was neither promised nor required, they reached a state of alignment that did not feel like an ending, but like a precise resting point. Beyond it, there was no path that remained faithful to what had been found. Remaining there was not stagnation. It was accuracy. Nothing further followed, because nothing further belonged. What unfolded next was not development, but endurance, and endurance revealed itself as the final form of truth available in this encounter. The anomaly did not transform under time, scrutiny, or reinterpretation. It did not soften into familiarity or harden into paradox. It simply remained, and that remaining became its most definitive attribute. In a landscape where meaning is often generated through change, persistence without evolution stood out as a statement in itself. The phenomenon did not need to assert its reality. It demonstrated it continuously by refusing to become anything else. This refusal was not active. It did not oppose inquiry. It did not repel analysis. It simply offered no traction. Every analytical framework approached it, made contact, and then found nothing to grip. There was no internal differentiation to exploit, no asymmetry to amplify, no instability to trace backward into cause. The anomaly behaved as though it existed at a point of maximal internal resolution, a state where all possible variations had already collapsed into a single, stable configuration. Such states are rare, not because they are fragile, but because they are complete. Completeness is often misunderstood as closure imposed from outside, a decision to stop looking. Here, completeness was intrinsic. It did not depend on consensus or exhaustion. It asserted itself through invariance. The anomaly did not change when approached differently. It did not reveal new facets under novel perspectives. It did not respond to shifts in theoretical framing. It remained the same across all legitimate modes of engagement. And in doing so, it quietly declared that there was nothing left to uncover. This declaration was not verbal. It was structural. It emerged from repetition, from the fact that every return produced the same outcome, and that every attempt to go further resulted not in resistance, but in irrelevance. The phenomenon did not block the path forward. It demonstrated that there was no path. This distinction was subtle but essential. Blocking implies conflict. Absence of path implies completion. As this understanding matured fully, The anomaly ceased to feel exceptional. It joined a class of facts that had always existed but had rarely been acknowledged, with such clarity facts that are encountered whole, not assembled, and that do not unfold into explanation because they are not constructed from explainable parts. These facts are not puzzles. They are states. Their existence does not depend on narrative. Their legitimacy does not depend on origin. They stand as they are, sufficient unto themselves. This sufficiency altered the emotional texture of inquiry. The tension that accompanies unresolved questions dissipated, replaced by a quieter form of respect. Respect not for mystery, but for structure. The anomaly was no longer approached with the expectation that it would eventually give way. It was approached with the understanding that it had already given everything it was going to give. That understanding did not diminish its significance. It clarified it. The phenomenon's role became that of a reference, a silent calibration point against which other discoveries were measured. When new irregularities appeared, they were not immediately framed as challenges to be overcome. They were first assessed for their category: were they incomplete, or were they complete without explanation? This distinction, once abstract, became operational. The anomaly had provided a concrete example of what completeness without explanation looked like, and that example reshaped judgment. In this reshaped landscape, inquiry became more precise. It learned to differentiate between the urge to understand and the obligation to remain faithful to what was actually present. The anomaly had exposed how easily these can diverge. Understanding seeks coherence. Fidelity seeks accuracy. When the two align, progress is possible. When they do not, fidelity must prevail. The anomaly demanded fidelity, and fidelity proved to be the more durable virtue. Time continued to pass, but it did nothing to the phenomenon. It did not contextualize it further. It did not erode its edges. It did not transform its status. The anomaly existed outside the arc of temporal clarification. It did not wait for future insight. It did not promise eventual resolution. It existed now exactly as it had existed then, unchanged by the passage of years. This temporal neutrality reinforced the conclusion that explanation was not forthcoming because it was not applicable. Eventually, even the language surrounding the anomaly grew sparse. It was no longer described as strange or puzzling. It was described as present. That word was sufficient. Presence did not imply understanding. It did not imply meaning. It implied only that something existed and could be engaged with accurately up to a point. Beyond that point, engagement ceased to be meaningful. The anomaly defined that point with unusual precision. In the end, the most accurate account of what happened is also the least dramatic. Scientists encountered a phenomenon that was fully real, fully stable, fully measurable, and fully indifferent to explanation. They pursued it until pursuit no longer increased fidelity. They stopped not because they failed, but because they succeeded in reaching the boundary intact. The phenomenon did not change. The approach to knowledge did. Scientists found this: they did not know how to explain it. And when they finally accepted that explanation was neither hidden nor delayed, but simply absent by nature, they reached the only conclusion that remained faithful to reality: that some truths do not unfold, do not deepen, and do not resolve. They stand complete at the moment they are recognized and ask only to be left exactly as they are. What followed after that acceptance was a slow normalization of restraint itself. Restraint stopped feeling like an exception, applied to a single phenomenon, and began to feel like a general skill, one that could be exercised deliberately, with precision, without apology. The anomaly had revealed that inquiry is not weakened by knowing where it ends. It is weakened only when it pretends not to. Once this distinction was absorbed, the intellectual environment became quieter, not in activity, but in excess. Fewer claims reached beyond their evidentiary footing. Fewer narratives were constructed solely to satisfy expectation. The anomaly had not reduced curiosity. It had disciplined it. This discipline did not emerge through doctrine or consensus. It emerged through repeated confrontation with the same immovable fact. Each time inquiry approached the anomaly, it encountered the same condition: total availability to measurement, total unavailability to explanation. This pairing became familiar. Familiarity did not produce contempt. It produced clarity. The phenomenon ceased to be framed as difficult. Difficulty implies resistance. The anomaly offered none. It was easy to observe and impossible to explain. And that combination proved to be decisive. The decisive element was not the impossibility of explanation itself, but the realization that impossibility was not provisional. There was no sense in which explanation was approaching asymptotically, no diminishing gap that suggested eventual convergence. The distance between description and explanation did not shrink with time or effort. It remained fixed. This fixed distance reclassified the problem entirely. It was not an unsolved question. It was a category boundary. Crossing it would require abandoning the very criteria that made the inquiry scientific in the first place. At that boundary, the anomaly assumed its final form not as a mystery, not as a warning, but as a stabilizing feature of understanding. It stabilized inquiry by removing a false trajectory. It prevented the endless cycling of effort that characterizes phenomena mistakenly treated as incomplete. By refusing to yield, it signaled clearly where continuation would cease to be aligned with evidence. This signal was not loud. It was consistent. Consistency, over time, proved impossible to ignore. The anomaly also reshaped how silence in data was interpreted. Silence was no longer automatically treated as absence or failure. It could be recognized as sufficiency, the state in which nothing more needed to be said because nothing more could be said truthfully. The anomaly's silence was of this kind. It did not conceal information. It did not point beyond itself. It was silent because it was already fully expressed in what it allowed to be measured. This recognition altered the rhythm of inquiry. Instead of pressing forward uniformly, investigation learned to pause selectively. Pausing was no longer equated with stagnation. It was equated with alignment. The anomaly had shown that there is a difference between not knowing enough and knowing exactly enough. It occupied the latter condition with exceptional clarity. Every attempt to extract more than what was present resulted not in discovery, but in distortion. That outcome, repeated enough times, redefined success. Success, in this context, became the ability to stop without regret, to stop without the lingering sense that something had been missed, to stop knowing that the phenomenon had been met fully, not partially. The anomaly allowed this because it did not leave traces of incompleteness. There were no anomalies within it, no inconsistencies to chase, no unresolved tensions in the data. Everything that could be said about it had been said, and everything that had been said remained correct. This is a rare condition. As this condition became familiar, the anomaly ceased to function as an example and began to function as an orientation. It oriented inquiry toward a more accurate understanding of its own limits. It demonstrated that the edge of knowledge is not always jagged or chaotic. Sometimes it is smooth, well-defined, and stable. The anomaly was such an edge. It did not fray under contact. It did not retreat. It simply marked a place where inquiry could stand without falling into speculation. The most enduring effect of this orientation was a recalibration of confidence. Confidence was no longer derived from the promise of eventual explanation, but from the reliability of description. If something could be described accurately and repeatedly, confidence was justified, even if explanation remained inaccessible. This decoupling of confidence from explanation was subtle, but profound. It allowed knowledge to be secure without being complete in the narrative sense. The anomaly exemplified this security perfectly. In time, the anomaly's presence became almost indistinguishable from the background assumptions of the field. It did not need to be cited explicitly. Its lesson was implicit in the care with which claims were framed and the precision with which limits were stated. It had reshaped practice without ever becoming doctrine. Its influence was visible only in what did not happen in the absence of overreach, in the absence of forced synthesis, in the absence of speculative closure. The phenomenon itself remained unchanged throughout all of this. It did not respond to improved instruments or refined analysis. It did not react to shifts in theoretical fashion. It existed as it always had, indifferent to the intellectual adjustments it had provoked. This indifference was not neglect. It was autonomy. The anomaly did not belong to inquiry. Inquiry belonged to the anomaly only insofar as it could approach without distortion. In the final accounting, what scientists encountered was not a challenge to be overcome, but a condition to be respected. They found something real that did not explain itself and did not need to. They learned that explanation is not the ultimate arbiter of truth, and that fidelity sometimes requires refusing to go further. The anomaly had enforced this lesson not through argument, but through presence. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it, and by learning when to stop, they learned something more enduring than explanation, the shape of accuracy itself. What followed after that acceptance was a slow normalization of restraint itself. Restraint stopped feeling like an exception applied to a single phenomenon and began to feel like a general skill, one that could be exercised deliberately, with precision, without apology. The anomaly had revealed that inquiry is not weakened by knowing where it ends. It is weakened only when it pretends not to. Once this distinction was absorbed, the intellectual environment became quieter, not in activity, but in excess. Fewer claims reached beyond their evidentiary footing. Fewer narratives were constructed solely to satisfy expectation. The anomaly had not reduced curiosity, it had disciplined it. This discipline did not emerge through doctrine or consensus. It emerged through repeated confrontation with the same immovable fact. Each time inquiry approached the anomaly, it encountered the same condition: total availability to measurement, total unavailability to explanation. This pairing became familiar. Familiarity did not produce contempt. It produced clarity. The phenomenon ceased to be framed as difficult. Difficulty implies resistance. The anomaly offered none. It was easy to observe and impossible to explain, and that combination proved to be decisive. The decisive element was not the impossibility of explanation itself, but the realization that impossibility was not provisional. There was no sense in which explanation was approaching asymptotically, no diminishing gap that suggested eventual convergence. The distance between description and explanation did not shrink with time or effort. It remained fixed. This fixed distance reclassified the problem entirely. It was not an unsolved question. It was a category boundary. Crossing it would require abandoning the very criteria that made the inquiry scientific in the first place. At that boundary, the anomaly assumed its final form, not as a mystery, not as a warning, but as a stabilizing feature of understanding. It stabilized inquiry by removing a false trajectory. It prevented the endless cycling of effort that characterizes phenomena mistakenly treated as incomplete. By refusing to yield, it signaled clearly where continuation would cease to be aligned with evidence. This signal was not loud. It was consistent. Consistency over time proved impossible to ignore. The anomaly also reshaped how silence in data was interpreted. Silence was no longer automatically treated as absence or failure. It could be recognized as sufficiency, the state in which nothing more needed to be said because nothing more could be said truthfully. The anomaly's silence was of this kind. It did not conceal information. It did not point beyond itself. It was silent because it was already fully expressed in what it allowed to be measured. This recognition altered the rhythm of inquiry. Instead of pressing forward uniformly, investigation learned to pause selectively. Pausing was no longer equated with stagnation. It was equated with alignment. The anomaly had shown that there is a difference between not knowing enough and knowing exactly enough. It occupied the latter condition with exceptional clarity. Every attempt to extract more than what was present resulted not in discovery, but in distortion. That outcome, repeated enough times, redefined success. Success, in this context, became the ability to stop without regret, to stop without the lingering sense that something had been missed, to stop knowing that the phenomenon had been met fully, not partially. The anomaly allowed this because it did not leave traces of incompleteness. There were no anomalies within it, no inconsistencies to chase, no unresolved tensions in the data. Everything that could be said about it had been said, and everything that had been said remained correct. This is a rare condition. As this condition became familiar, the anomaly ceased to function as an example and began to function as an orientation. It oriented inquiry toward a more accurate understanding of its own limits. It demonstrated that the edge of knowledge is not always jagged or chaotic. Sometimes it is smooth, well-defined, and stable. The anomaly was such an edge. It did not fray under contact. It did not retreat. It simply marked a place where inquiry could stand without falling into speculation. The most enduring effect of this orientation was a recalibration of confidence. Confidence was no longer derived from the promise of eventual explanation, but from the reliability of description. If something could be described accurately and repeatedly, confidence was justified, even if explanation remained inaccessible. This decoupling of confidence from explanation was subtle, but profound. It allowed knowledge to be secure without being complete in the narrative sense. The anomaly exemplified this security perfectly. In time, the anomaly's presence became almost indistinguishable from the background assumptions of the field. It did not need to be cited explicitly. Its lesson was implicit in the care with which claims were framed and the precision with which limits were stated. It had reshaped practice without ever becoming doctrine. Its influence was visible only in what did not happen, in the absence of overreach, in the absence of forced synthesis, in the absence of speculative closure. The phenomenon itself remained unchanged throughout all of this. It did not respond to improved instruments or refined analysis. It did not react to shifts in theoretical fashion. It existed as it always had, indifferent to the intellectual adjustments it had provoked. This indifference was not neglect, it was autonomy. The anomaly did not belong to inquiry. Inquiry belonged to the anomaly only insofar as it could approach without distortion. In the final accounting, what scientists encountered was not a challenge to be overcome, but a condition to be respected. They found something real that did not explain itself and did not need to. They learned that explanation is not the ultimate arbiter of truth, and that fidelity sometimes requires refusing to go further. The anomaly had enforced this lesson not through argument, but through presence. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it, and by learning when to stop, they learned something more enduring than explanation, the shape of accuracy itself. What remains, at the very end, is not a revelation, but a settled alignment that no longer shifts under pressure. The anomaly has fully completed its role, not by transforming, not by yielding, not by being absorbed into theory, but by remaining exactly what it was from the moment it was first recognized. It has demonstrated, with an almost austere clarity, that some encounters with reality do not lead forward into explanation, but inward into precision. They do not expand knowledge by adding layers. They refine it by defining edges. The final understanding is therefore not about the anomaly itself, but about the nature of contact between inquiry and world. Inquiry advances by motion, by probing, by decomposing, by tracing paths from cause to effect. But inquiry also requires a capacity for stillness, for recognizing when motion ceases to correspond to truth. The anomaly enforced that stillness without resistance. It did not collapse under scrutiny. It did not fracture into components. It did not reveal a hidden mechanism after sufficient persistence. It simply remained present, coherent, lawful, and causally silent. That silence was not empty. It was exact. It carried no message because it was not a signal. It carried no promise because it was not transitional. It was not a gateway to deeper understanding. It was a terminus, a place where observation arrives intact and explanation does not follow, not because it failed, but because it does not belong. The phenomenon did not owe an account of itself. It existed, and existence was sufficient. In accepting this, science did not lose ground. It gained proportion. It learned in a way that could not be unlearned. That explanation is a tool rather than a destiny. That some facts are fully known without being fully understood. And that the discipline to stop is as essential as the drive to continue. The anomaly did not undermine confidence in knowledge. It refined confidence by separating what can be described faithfully from what can only be imagined. Nothing further emerges from the anomaly because nothing further is contained within it. It does not point elsewhere. It does not unfold over time. It does not await reinterpretation. It stands complete, unchanged by attention and unaffected by neglect. The record surrounding it does not trail into uncertainty. It ends cleanly, exactly where fidelity requires it to end. Scientists found this. They did not know how to explain it. And in the end, they understood that this was not a failure of knowledge, not a gap awaiting closure, not a mystery demanding resolution, but a finished fact, one that revealed, with quiet authority, that reality does not always speak in reasons, and that truth does not always arrive with explanation attached. The world remained. The phenomenon remained. Inquiry moved on, more precise for having learned where and how to stop.
We upload new videos every single day, so make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps the channel grow. Tell us in the comments what you'd like to see next. Your ideas might be in our next upload. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of our community. Stay tuned, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.